Lopez. Delegate Lopez.
Unmute, Alfonso.
We'll come back. Delegate Simon.
Here.
Delegate Rasool.
Here.
Delegate Lindsay. Delegate Lindsay. Delegate Sullivan.
They changed the order of seniority. I mean, we're...
Please mute your microphones.
more senior.
Delegate Price.
Well, it's the order of seniority for the Democrats, and then...
Delegate Levine.
Here.
Delegate Heretic. Delegate Mullen.
Here.
Delegate Bourne.
Here. Here.
Delegate Delaney.
Here.
Delegate Carol Foy.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning. Delegate Helmer.
Here.
Delegate Cole of Fredericksburg.
Here.
Delegate Simons.
Here.
Delegate Scott. Delegate Jenkins.
Here.
Delegate Kilgore.
Here.
Delegate Wright.
Here.
Delegate Bell.
Here.
Delegate Robinson.
Here.
Delegate Wilt.
Here.
Delegate Ranson.
Here.
Delegate Ferris.
Here.
Thank you, sir. Delegate Rush.
Here.
Delegate Davis.
Here.
Delegate Leftwich.
Here.
Delegate Adams of Pennsylvania.
Here.
Delegate Campbell of Smith.
Here.
Delegate Miares.
Here.
Delegate Campbell of Rockbridge.
Here.
Delegate Coiner.
Here.
Delegate Batten.
Here.
Mr. Chair, a quorum is present, and I'll call the remaining names after the meeting.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. I want to welcome committee members from the House Courts of Justice and Public Safety Committees and everyone viewing today's hearing. This is the first in a series of joint hearings we intend to hold on criminal justice and police reform. Ever since the murder of George Floyd, it became apparent to me and many others that the General Assembly must take decisive but appropriate and meaningful action to address racial inequalities in our criminal justice system. The purpose of these hearings is to engage in a community conversation about just what action we take in the special session. Throughout this process, we will be hearing from national and state experts, and each hearing will provide an opportunity to hear from the public. I intend to use this as an opportunity to listen and to learn. But make no mistake, at the conclusion of this process, we will take action. The sense of urgency is growing, and we cannot ignore these issues any longer. At this time, I'd like to yield to Leader Herring for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Hope, and thank you for everybody joining us and for our guests. On behalf of the Courts of Justice Committee, I'm so grateful because over these next few weeks, we are undertaking what I think will be very important special session. With respect to police reform, it cannot be ignored that for many years there has been a fear of Black and brown people when it comes to our police. For us, a stop is not merely because perhaps we have a tail light out. A stop means that there is an immediate reaction, that we must recall what our parents taught us so that we can survive and stop. I do not mean to suggest that all police officers are bad actors. To the contrary, I believe many in our police departments enter the profession to serve their communities. However, the video of Mr. Floyd being killed and seeing the video of Mr. Thompson being harassed by a state trooper from Virginia, taking no action would not be a service for Virginians. It is incumbent that we listen to our experts, our guests, and the public to formulate evidence-based policy and act. With respect to criminal justice reform, there have been inequities in our system for hundreds of years. This is where that ends. All of us must be brave enough to reimagine our criminal justice system. I believe we, for far too long, have introduced bills for the sake of saying we've done something on reform. That ends now. It is no longer acceptable to introduce and pass something that results in inequities and leave people behind. It is time for us all to open our minds and ears to all sides of the debate and pass laws that are evidence-based and reach a more equitable result. Thank you, Chairman Ho.
Thank you, Madam Leader, for those remarks. Before we begin, I'd like to explain the ground rules for testimony on the matters before us today. Our committees have had a long history of being courteous, respectful, and civil to one another, and while we may have different views on a wide range of topics, we have always maintained a high level of decorum and respect in civil discourse, and I expect that to continue. To those watching the webcast, I want to thank you for joining us today. We really want to hear from you. We listen to you and we take your views very seriously. Your input is welcome and important to us. Viewpoints should be made concisely and respectfully, and comments should be directed to the chair at all times. To the extent possible, we have tried to provide for the expression of a variety of viewpoints by balancing the number of speakers in favor and those opposed. To move through the agenda in an efficient manner, and if you've looked at the agenda, we have quite a full schedule today, I've asked all speakers to limit their comments to a certain amount of time. To be fair and respectful to everyone, we are using a timer. I will call out when 30 seconds remain for each presenter and ask that you wrap up your comments up at that time. To members of the public offering testimony today, staff will bring you into the meeting room when I call your name to speak. Not surprisingly, we had more speakers sign up than we have time for today. The good news is we have 2 other hearings. Those selected should have an email sent to them with a special link to join the meeting to get into the speaker's queue. I ask that you look for that email. When doing so, when you present, please turn on your camera and microphone, identify yourself and whether you represent any particular group, and please speak for no more than 3 minutes. While I don't anticipate it to be an issue, failure to adhere to any of these guidelines may result in a caller being excused from the meeting. For members of the committee, I would ask that you raise your hand, the raise your hand feature that is in the Teams button, the bar in the middle of the screen. If you don't have one, please make sure you get my attention, but after each speaker, I will look at that screen to see who has raised their hand, and I will call on those who have gotten in the queue first. If you don't have that feature, please get my attention after all the other folks that have been asked to speak. Now, if there are no other questions at this time, I will call the first speaker. Colonel Gary Suttle from the Virginia State Police. Welcome. Thank you for being here.
Good morning, Chairman, Madam Chair Herring, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today regarding such an important topic. The PowerPoint presentation that we have, if you could pull up slide 1, please. Slide 2, please, I'm sorry. If you could advance to slide 2, please.
Mr. Chair, we're working on that. If you'll just give us a moment, please. Thank you.
We could go back to slide 2. That would be great. While we're working on that, presentation consists of about 36 slides, and I'll go through those rather quickly. In the slide 2, when it comes up, you'll see the agenda for the topics of discussion for today's presentation. I'll briefly, again, talk about those policies and where we're at with regards to those particular topics. The first topic, the Commission on Accreditation for Law Enforcement, CLEA, if you will. I'll touch briefly, if you hit that slide, on the benefits of the organization whereby VSP standards are constantly reviewed for compliance and routinely reviewed in accordance with modern-day policing and national standards as set forth by CLEA. Second item I'll touch on briefly will be VSP, Virginia State Police employment, and our selection process. And it includes the types of tests we get, the medical, psychological examinations, and disqualifiers under that topic. And thirdly, I'll talk about our use of force policy, what is in place now, and work through that process as well. And two more topics. One will be reporting misconduct and intervening. That will include bias-free policing and other related policies at a very high level. And lastly, a decertification process. And with regards to some of the challenges, and maybe list a few VSP concerns moving forward as potential legislation may be enacted. Still slide 2. Okay. We can move on to slide 3, please. We're on slide 4, but I'll marry the two. Slide 3 just asks who we are, much like slide 4, but it's important to know that we are an agency, most importantly, that works and tries to develop relationships with the public, our partners, and our people as well. Slide 4, please. And with that in mind, which leads us to our mission statement, building public trust by securing the Commonwealth through leadership, collaboration, and community engagement. This is very important, and it also, again, drives our values and ultimately our culture and who we are as an agency. Slide 5, please. Virginia State Police is a nationally accredited agency, and if you haven't heard of CLEA before, this is a Commission on Accreditation for Law Enforcement Agencies. It's an intense review of the agency with regards to having demonstrated, again, compliance with CLEA standards, and what we strive for is the gold standard benchmark. And I'm happy to say since 1986, which we were one of 2 state police agencies, the first to come online with CLEA, we've achieved that status. Again, most importantly, as you dig into CLEA, this distinguished accreditation process confirms the agency's commitment to continuous development and professional delivery of public safety services as it relates to compliance with constitutional requirements, alternatives to arrest, use of force, discretion, bias-free policing, unreasonable force, use of deadly force, and administrative investigations, and so on. There's a long list of standards. If we could go to slide 6, please. This is just kind of captures what I said in a few remarks for your review later. Slide 7 does as well. If we could move to slide 8, please. Slide 8, sworn employment and selection. On average, the process for hiring a Virginia State Trooper, by the time we start the process and they walk into the training academy, it's about 4 to 6 months. The next few slides will demonstrate why the process is longer than might be compared to other agencies and or other state police agencies across the country. It's vigorous and thorough. Slide 9, please. You will see on the slide here, of course we jumped to 10 there, but anyway, slide 9 covers just some of the basic processes on the front end. Of course, we advertise our jobs on Virginia Jobs on the website that you see on the screen. There are the applications received or screened for automatic disqualifiers. You'll see that on slide 13 through 15 when we get to that point. The approved applications, once they're approved, they move to a personal history questionnaire and then on to a testing phase where applicants are fingerprinted, sign and release one go physical assessment, and then moves into a written test as required by LESI, which is Law Enforcement and Services Incorporated. Slide 10, please. You'll see that the company that we use is a third-party company, and we've used them for a number of years, and they are nationally known and recognized and used by other agencies. They're well proven in what they perform and provide to us when making decisions with regards to hiring troopers. You'll see also there's a polygraph involved in our hiring process. Background investigation that is very intense as well. Most times leads us out of the state where we follow up on information that needs to be vetted. There's a medical examination and psychological evaluation. Slide 11, please. This I won't go into in depth. This just talks about the LESI pre-employment assessment process and its assessments. It's different types of measures that it provides us for making predictions and recommendations and measuring a particular candidate as to whether or not they are suitable for law enforcement. Slide 12, please. The LESI process and credentials, again, this can be read at your convenience, but this just talks about the final report that is produced and forwarded to our HR department, where that is reviewed and again assessed as to how that fits into a hiree. Slide 12, 13. I mentioned earlier sworn disqualifiers, and 13, slide 13, 14, and 15 have a number of disqualifiers. These are on the front end. I won't go into all of these, but a lot of these are directly related to felony convictions, pleading guilty to a felony, no contest to any misdemeanor with regard to moral turpitude, and you can read on in the second bullet, and thirdly, there are misdemeanor sex offenses in the Commonwealth or any other state, but not limited to sexual battery under certain code sections, and you can see that. Those are obviously automatic disqualifiers. Slide 14, please. More of the disqualifiers listed. These have to do with, again, sex offender registry and a conviction thereof, use of certain drugs, Schedule 1 and Schedule 2. Slide 15. Again, a few more disqualifiers. Slide 16, please. This is the next few slides, actually will be slides 16 through 27. A lot of information here, and I'll dig just a little deeper into the application of force, our policy, and our training. The slides you see here is training that was conducted at our driver training complex in Blackstone, Virginia. We have a training complex there, a driver training complex, if you will, and I'll talk briefly here shortly about the different types of training with regards to de-escalation, crisis management, stressful situations that our troopers are put in to test their training and their ability to become a trooper. But you'll see in this particular slide here, there's a training gun that's colored by blue. You may see another slide with that as well. Those are, again, training scenarios and at Blackstone Complex. Next slide, please, number 17. The agency, Virginia State Police, trains extensively on the use of appropriate and proportionate force. And to effect an arrest, and we also include with that fair and impartial policing. The training begins with our basic students, or recruits, if you will, is continually reviewed and discussed in our ongoing careers and the development of our careers. And that is from basic school right on through in-service training. You're going to see in the next few slides categories of training that touch on de-escalation contexts and training and where that applies to certain pockets of training.
Colonel Suttle, can I ask you to, you have 30 seconds remaining, can I ask you to begin to wrap up?
Yes, sir. Can you go to slide 19, please? I'll wrap up while we're going here in regards to our policy. When we have a use of force policy, when we have a use of force, there's the policy automatically kicks in where supervisor is contacted and immediately responds to the scene. And you'll see in the PowerPoint later on, obviously I won't have time to get to that, but the different situations where we respond to use of force situations. And that's where photographs are taken, all witnesses are interviewed, all evidence is secured, in-car camera footage, and so on, to make recommendations up through the chain of command. And it's a multi-layered, about five, 6 different levels of review and recommendation.
Thank you, Colonel Suttle. Thank you, Colonel Suttle. I'm going to ask members if they have any questions to use the raise your hand feature on the site. I do have a question. I want to get your reaction to body-worn cams and what the position of Virginia State Police is. And if you were to have such an item, how long would it take you? How much would it cost in order to implement a body-worn camera program into the Virginia State Police?
Yes, thank you, sir, for that question. For the benefit of the audience, we piloted the body-worn camera last year, and when the moratorium was set in, we had to pull the pilot project. We had cameras here in the Richmond area. It's very positive. Our troopers embraced it. In fact, we support the body cameras. And with regards to the cost, in the implementation, it's about 18 to 24 months to complete the installation and fully implement the body-worn camera. So there is a length of time, and that's the infrastructure that needs to be put in place, the technology, and some of the platforms. We have a proposal, and this was from a vendor that we have worked with before. It's a high-level camera that is will meet our needs. It's robust. And for an option, there's 2 different options that were proposed to us. 1 to 5 year contract. The implementation, that's total everything, lock, stock, and barrel, was $23 million for our agency. Option 2, 2 to 10 year contract, that was $46 million to outfit the agency. And the interesting thing, or the benefit to this particular camera, is it's very easily installed, cuts our maintenance and our installation almost in half. So I hope that answers your questions.
No, thank you. So we do have some questions in the queue. Delegate Bourne, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Colonel Suttle, thank you for being with us today. I guess my question, maybe it's too broad, maybe it's not specific enough, but I would ask, what, in your estimation, based on your experience and your time serving as a law enforcement officer, what needs to change? Because clearly these cookie cutter, sort of reasonably necessary type standards and policy descriptions and guidance aren't working, because we're still continuing to see too many incidents of excessive force. And so, as Chairman Hope laid out in the beginning, we're here to solicit input, feedback, and testimony from those who are experts. And so, understanding what the goal is, what would be your recommendation?
Thank you, Delegate Bourne. can take several right off the top. One being, we talk about de-escalation, and that's not a new term with regards to training. And I think the emphasis has to be put on de-escalation for passive resistance. And as that level of resistance increases, then be very cognizant of what tools are available to us. And the de-escalation, what we have found here at the State Police Academy is we conduct what we call mega practicals. And that's done at our training complex. And that's a culmination of a number of trainings, and that's from crisis management to mental illness to stressful situations. And it allows us to test the de-escalation training that we get into the classroom. There's nothing like practical de-escalation exercises. And it comes from, again, from a simple traffic stop to a more elevated situation where you're going in knowing that it could potentially be very much more dangerous. So the de-escalation is certainly one of those topics. And we just spoke about the body cameras. We found that video footage is very beneficial to us. It allows us to review not only when a complaint is made, but we review that on a regular basis every month. Our supervisors do to see if we can. Body-worn cameras are very critical piece or a tool for us to capture and use from a training standpoint and an evidentiary standpoint. Those two are very much high priorities of ours. The decertification of police officers, I know that's a topic in of itself. We decertified since, I believe, 2016, 13 troopers because of their behavior and their actions that we felt that that needed to be requested. And some of that fit into, and you'll see a section in the PowerPoint in the end of that decertification. There are some that are automatically just decertified because of their actions. Perhaps it's time to re-examine additional decertifying events. I think that is often all over the place. Sometimes when we have violations that are reported, criminal violations, things that may fit into the decertification process, depends on which office is reviewing that. A Commonwealth attorney may review that and decide not to prosecute, where you could go to another jurisdiction, and they certainly would. The consistency there is needed, and it would help guide us. And from the standpoint of if someone has had bad behavior, and there's no prosecution, then we have to deal with that within the agency, within policy and DHR and rules. And sometimes that is that's a very tedious process working through that.
Thank you very much. Delegate Scott, you're recognized.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. I guess I've seen some. My question is, I've seen some disturbing video from well over a year, my understanding, involving an officer on the street with a stop. And the person who he stopped was actually charged with a crime and actually pled guilty to it. And then this video came out, and I'm sure you're aware of it. I think it happened in Arlington. And one of the issues that I have is that we don't know what corrective actions are being taken when it's if they've been on their job and something has come up, they look so confident in wrongdoing. Some of the officers look so confident in wrongdoing. It's as though they know that there will be no repercussions. They will not be held accountable for their actions. So I guess what I'm trying to figure out, I was looking at your presentation, and I've looked at a lot of the policies and procedures that officers have, that law enforcement have, and it just looks like the policy and procedure is enough to get rid of folks like that, but nobody does anything about it. It seems to be a cultural issue of acceptance of this misbehavior more so than a policy issue. The policy, it works, it should work, but it looks like no one's enforcing it. And so I'm asking you, what changes need to happen to make sure, yeah, we may implement some stronger language, But how do you ensure that the folks at the top, and how does the public have any confidence in that? If you could tell us what are you doing differently now in post George Floyd? What are you doing differently?
Thank you for the question, sir. And you were broken up a little bit, so I think I got the gist of what your question was. I apologize if I didn't capture all of that. You're asking what we are doing differently now. The reality is that we're constantly training and looking at because of the George Floyd instance. That caused us to go back and look at all of our policies to make sure, with regards to the knee on the neck, to make sure in our training, or were we teaching that? And the reality is we were not, and our policies reflect that. So it's a constant evaluation of major incidents like the George Floyd, and it sickened us to say that. There's no question about it. No one agrees with that, how that went down, and that made us even dig in even more to all of our policies with regards to use of force and even the reporting of that. One thing that I can say is our use of force reporting is very robust. It has a number of levels of reporting mechanisms in place. So we're constantly evaluating that as well, sir, to make sure that we, in a lot of cases, when you have video and we have a complaint, we'll discover other violations of standards of conduct, and we'll handle that appropriately. And so with regards to what we're doing today, I think the continuation of reevaluating how we do business is necessary.
I guess, if I may, Mr. Chairman, I follow up. I hope I can be heard. I guess what I'm trying to...
Delegate Scott, and Colonel Settle, if you could speak a little louder, we're having a hard time hearing you. Go ahead, Delegate Scott, really quickly. I got a couple.
Okay, I guess the only thing I'm hearing is I'm not hearing transparency and accountability. I hear you saying training and looking at, but what I'm saying is how do we know what actions have been taken? What are you doing to ensure the public that when an officer does something like the guy in Arlington who choked a young man and yanked him out of a car, I'm sure you saw the video. What happened to that guy? How do we know what happened to him? Is he still on the force? Is he still in the state police? Is he still on the street? What's happening with this guy, and how does the public know what's happening other than a lawsuit being filed?
Yes, sir. With regards to the incident in Arlington, actually Fairfax County, a year ago, once we learned on July 13th, we saw, yes, I've seen saw the video as well. I watched it, and certainly was inappropriate, and again caused me great concern. We immediately initiated a criminal investigation. That was not because someone told us to. That particular footage was not footage that we had when the investigation was conducted back in 2019. But we immediately took that action of opening up a criminal investigation, put an investigative team on that, day in and day out. In fact, we're at the point now where we're ready to present all of the findings and pulling back also the investigation that was done last year and connecting some more dots because we have new information and presenting that to the Commonwealth Attorney. His office will be reviewing that. If it could be at this very time, sometime by the end of the week, that will be reviewed. And so we took the appropriate action there. We didn't wait for someone to tell us to do that. Had we known about that video a year ago, what you're seeing, what I'm explaining now that's taking place, what took place last year. And with regards to the officer, he is on leave. He was placed on leave pending the criminal investigation and follow-up administrative investigation with regards to his actions. That is in accordance with policy, DHLRM policy, and which affords due process. We have to work within the guidelines of that. Once those findings come back and whatever they may be, then we'll take the appropriate action from that point on. I don't know what that'll be. That's certainly up to the prosecutor and in the jurisdiction where this information was presented. One last thing, you talk about reporting and intervening. We get some questions about in this particular case last week, there's been questions about the two troopers and their why didn't they intervene? We do intervention training. We have it as a part of our ethics. And if you see a trooper doing something wrong or anyone doing anything wrong, intervene quickly. What we didn't have, sir, was a specific policy laying that out in its own domain, if you will. Although we train that in every piece of interaction we have with regards to violator contact, just normal contact with citizens. But we saw a need based on post-George Floyd and some of the other incidents that we see across the country, not only the one that involves us from a year ago, George Floyd, but there are other incidents that we take and we evaluate as a staff at the training academy and say, what can we learn from this? How can we make our policies more robust? So we're actively involved in that 24/7. So with regards to intervention, our legal specialists right now, along with our academy staff, are working to devise a policy with regards to specifically laying out in its own policy with regards to intervention. If another police officer is on scene and sees something that's not appropriate.
Thank you for that response. Delegate Campbell, you're recognized.
I don't hear Delegate Campbell. Does anybody hear him?
Delegate Campbell, are you there? All right, Delegate Levine, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Oh, wait, I think Delegate Campbell's come back.
I thought the microphone was unmuted. Colonel, the Academy teaches defensive tactics, especially for new Academy troopers and from time to time during resurfacing for the older troopers. What or who approves these defensive tactics that are taught to state troopers?
They're approved by the training director of the academy, who participates regularly with the Department of Criminal Justice Services with regards to training standards. Is actively involved in that, and by code, I sit on that body as well, and also sit on the executive committee that addresses a number of things, but most importantly, decertification. So it's approved by the director of the academy.
Okay, but there is an outside agency that does approve the training. The Criminal Justice Services.
That's correct. DCJS establishes the minimal standards, and we can go above and beyond that, and we do. You'll see in the PowerPoint the number of hours that we spend in particular areas. That's above and beyond what is required of DCJS, and that could be in the area of legal updates, defensive tactics, cultural diversity and awareness, verbal de-escalation, firearms, advanced diversity and inclusion training, and so forth and so on. Crisis management training as well.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Colonel Settle. Delegate Levine, we got to be moving here. Delegate Levine, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Colonel Settle, I'd like to follow up on Delegate Scott's question. And basically, if you could walk us through the procedure whereby a citizen complains about some conduct of a police officer, who handles the complaint? When does an outside agency handle it if it's too close to home, so to speak? And then how is the public supposed to find out the results of the complaint? If it's closed and there's no action taken, is the original citizen informed? Basically, you told us something that I was unaware of regarding this particular police officer. How is it in general that the public is informed in every stage of the process? If it's turned over to the Commonwealth Attorney, what is the procedure when someone complains?
Yes, sir. Thank you for the question. If a citizen makes a complaint, let me back up. First of all, there's a citizen complaint form that's available on our website. we refer citizens to that as well, where they can document their particular concern, and that will be forwarded to our Internal Affairs Division, where it is recognized and categorized and assigned. If there's a complaint that is made in the field within a division, we have 7 divisions across the Commonwealth. If a supervisor receives a phone call from a complainant that says they're true and alleges improper behavior and action by a trooper, he or she can initiate an investigation right there on the spot. They can investigate that within their purview. There are certain offenses that are listed in our manual that we do not farm out to the divisions, if you will. The immediate supervisors, first, second line supervisors, they automatically go to internal affairs to create a distance between the trooper who is alleged to have committed a certain behavior and this unit. That's all they do all the time. They travel all over the state and investigate the complaints. Once that complaint is investigated, all the witnesses, evidence collected, and so forth, that's submitted to the division commander and ultimately to the supervisor, that trooper, where recommendations are given as to the appropriate level of discipline, whether that's canceling or dismissal, depends on the offense. And our current policy is categorized between group offenses. Group 1, not as severe. Group 2, more severe. Group 3, severe, more times than not, could result in suspension and or termination. So once those investigations are determined, it's determined that the discipline that's given, the trooper is called in, and that discipline is given, and whether that be training, remedial training, whether it be anger management, whether it be, in some cases, we decide that this trooper may need a psychological evaluation and a fitness for duty based on his or her actions. There are a number of tools that are listed in our PowerPoint that are available too. If it's a criminal allegation or a criminal allegation, then that automatically goes to our Bureau of Criminal Investigation, which is separate from our Bureau of Field Operations. They'll put a special agent on that and or special agents, whatever other specialties may be needed, investigate that thoroughly, consult with the Commonwealth Attorney, turn over those findings, much like the case that we were made aware of last week. Same process, Commonwealth Attorney will review that and give us a finding whether prosecution will be seeked or not. If it's not, then it falls back to the administrative process that I described earlier.
All right,
So brief follow-up.
I don't really have time for follow-ups. Delegate Watts, brief question, and I have to wrap up. We have to go to the next speaker. Delegate Watts, you're recognized for a brief question.
This is brief. It's simply a request of the Colonel regarding the LESI screening. Could you please provide me with a link to the psychometric traits element of that screening? Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Delegate Watson. Thank you, Colonel Settle, for your testimony. We greatly appreciate you being here. Next speaker is John Jones with the Virginia Sheriff's Association. John, are you there? Welcome. Thank you for being here. You have 10 minutes.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for inviting me. Good morning, Leader Herring. We certainly appreciate you taking our testimony. This is a very important issue for the Virginia Sheriff's Association. So within my 10 minutes, what I thought I would do is structure my comments around the purpose of the special session, which will be the budget, mention a few issues relating to sheriffs that relate to all of this, to the committees, and the COVID-19. We have one item to discuss there, and then to focus on reform issues, and that will be at the end of my presentation. But I want to again thank you for inviting the Virginia Sheriff's Association to be a part of this. It hasn't gone unnoticed. So slide 1, the next page, please. Just to talk about a little bit of the service calls, law enforcement service calls that the sheriffs receive. And this is based on a study by the University of Lynchburg. we receive 3.1 million calls annually that were reporting to the study. Of the, some calls require one deputy to go, some calls back up, or maybe multiple deputies to go. Some calls are handled over the phone, but we get a lot of calls, and it comes to around 8,500 per day. That's quite a lot going on out here in these 86 counties where sheriff. It comes to about 61,000 arrests. And I'll put a table there to show you the arrest of the sheriffs and the major police departments, the state police, and the other agencies. And we extracted this information from information provided by the Virginia State Police. Next slide, please. I think I would be remiss if I didn't touch on the jail population and what's going on there. And I've got two snapshots of jail population. The first one is September the 28th. Last fall, we had slightly over 28,000 inmates. And then just a couple of weeks ago, we were down to 22,637 inmates, down 5,400 inmates in these local jails. And this includes local and regional jails. And there are probably more inmates in regional jails than local jails, but this figure includes everyone. And what the sheriffs did to address COVID was, well, first of all, the court system shut down, so there were fewer people coming in the front door. But the sheriffs worked with their judges. They did home electronic incarceration. They did everything they could to lower those numbers to keep COVID out of the jails. And, I think they've done a great job with it. As of this week, a little bit earlier, in the last few days, I think there were about 135 or 36 cases. And, there are jails that would have an outbreak and have cases, and then the sheriffs would deal with it and get rid of all of the cases. And of those 136 cases, that is going on in one jail. So most of those cases are in one jail. Next slide, please. Court services, a major part, and every sheriff does court services. Not every sheriff does law enforcement, 86 do. Not every sheriff runs a jail, but every sheriff does court cases or court security and civil process. It's quite a undertaking. We serve more than 3 million processes per year, and of course provide security in all the circuit, general district, and juvenile and domestic relation courts. So let's talk a little bit about the staff shortages relating to the three major functions of sheriffs. We all know that the law enforcement function that is provided by the sheriffs that are primary in law enforcement in 86 of the counties where there's no local police force. The General Assembly has established a staffing standard of one deputy sheriff to 1,500 population. And back in the 90s, that was actually increased. It used to be one deputy sheriff to 2,000 population, but now it's one deputy sheriff to 1,500. And we are short by 254 law enforcement deputy sheriffs in counties where sheriffs have primary law enforcement. The jail figures, and this includes, I believe this includes regional jails, but there's a major shortage in the jails of 691 positions, and that's based on a staffing standard by the compensation board. So all of these standards are not something that the sheriffs came up with. These are endorsed by the compensation board, approved by the compensation board, or statutory in the case of the law enforcement. The court services staffing standard, we're short by 115 positions. So if you look at all of our positions that we're short, it's 1,060. And I bring this up because of, with everything being discussed, people are talking about defunding, and I think we've already been defunded. What's happened is that if you were to reduce funding for the compensation board for the sheriff's budget, the only thing we really get anymore is personnel. So it would be even more layoffs. So that's important. I want to go to the next slide, please. So on the three major areas, Mr. Chairman and members, the budget recommendation is one that I think you could look at. Take a look at the second bullet and look at what the Commonwealth pays deputy sheriffs. It's $33,475 a year. Now, That's not necessarily what they make, because many localities have obviously viewed that as way too low and have supplemented it. Most do supplement it, but there are many, many that do not. And so as a result of that, if you just look at the turnover, corrections deputies is 17%, our law enforcement deputies 15%, and court deputies, and that one is up significantly this year, it's almost 18% for a total of around 16% turnover. Now, Mr. Chairman and members, that means that one of every 5 or 6 deputy sheriffs or sheriff hires every year is going to leave. And what we're finding is happening, the sheriff will struggle to get a qualified deputy with no record that passes a background investigation, in many cases a psychological background. We hire the person, we send him to the regional academy or the local academy, as the case may be, and then 1 in 6 of those people are leaving and going to another law enforcement agency or moving on. It's a difficult struggle to deal with that. And so we think it's really important that the General Assembly take a look at the budgets that were already approved before COVID hit. And this was the conference report. It was 2% bonus in December of 20. The 3% across the board is actually for July of 21. And then the 29 court positions, which addresses shortages in every sheriff's office, because if you remember what I said a minute ago, all sheriffs deal with courts. So if we can get those 29 positions, it will affect the staffing standard in all of the sheriff's offices. The next slide, please. One recommendation on COVID, and I think we've already discussed it. There are patrons, I think, that are ready to put bills in. I know of one patron, Delegate Jones, is going to introduce a bill that, and this is for all law enforcement, the sheriffs, the police, and all of the first responders. And it simply will provide that COVID is a presumption, like other presumptions that law enforcement and first responders face. The VSA is supporting this legislation. It's these public servants come in contact with COVID on a daily basis. And many of the first responders have contracted the disease, and some that I'm personally aware of have been permanently disabled because of it. And so if you take a snapshot on this and look back, everybody thought sheriffs and law enforcement, we were great a month ago. We were going out in COVID, we were answering calls, we were going in, and now the tide has turned because of the George Floyd situation and because of other situations going on. So let me talk about quickly in the next slide on page 6.
Yeah, please do, John. You have about 30 seconds.
Okay, let me hit 2 of the issues on reform. I want to make sure everyone understands that we decry any form of bias, prejudice, profiling, any form of discrimination, and unnecessary and excessive use of force, and we always have. 2 of the concerns of the Citizens Review Board. We think a sheriff's model for a law enforcement agency already has the ultimate citizen review board because the sheriff is elected. And secondly, on page 7, on qualified immunity, we're concerned about, let's go to page 7, please, next slide. Qualified immunity, we haven't seen a bill on it, but we're looking at major changes. I know some people are looking at major changes. We would be concerned about that. And there, almost flip over to page 8. If you go to page 8, there are some things that we think you can look at that maybe you could deal with pretty quickly. And one is the officer decertification. It needs to be used more, and it needs to be expanded. So when you decertify an officer, they stay decertified. A statewide database for decertified officers or officers otherwise unfit to serve, and caution to protect the officer so that it's not unfounded accusations. Creating a duty to intervene is good, and enhancing CIT training is good. In Virginia, we have the Virginia Law Enforcement Professional Standards Commission, and it works, and it needs to be enhanced and there is language in the Appropriations Act that deals with it, but that could be expanded. The next page, and I'll finish up. Everything is a product of the Virginia Sheriff's Association Select Committee on Law Enforcement, and the members of there, we've chosen the committee from all over the state. Sheriff Morgan from Newport News is the chairman, and I think you'll hear from him a little bit later on. With that, we have to try to answer any questions you want.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Delegate Bourne, you're in the queue. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, John, for testifying today. I have to be honest and say that I am a little frustrated that you spent 90% of your presentation talking about money and budgetary issues when these hearings are dedicated to how we're going to reform the way that law enforcement interacts and protects the communities that they're sworn to serve. And so I looked at your slides with what we can do and what we should do. That to me is all fruit. And I wonder what kind of heavy changes are you and the sheriffs willing to make? Because some of those things are very important to members of this committee. Some of these things are very important and very necessary to prevent the type of excessive force use that we've seen in the Commonwealth and in this country. Not most importantly, but personally to me, I would hope that we will make some changes to qualified immunity, because these officers, the departments they serve, and the localities that they work for need to be held accountable when they go beyond the bounds of their duties and use of force. And so talk to me a little bit, talk to the committee a little bit about how far are the sheriffs going to roll up their sleeves, get to work so that lives can be saved, and we can address this problem.
Thank you, Delegate Bourne and Mr. Chairman. And let me say I addressed my comments based on the three areas that the governor called a special session, and the 10 minutes probably should have moved through a little bit quicker on it to get to the reform issues. But we believe that there are some low-hanging fruit that you could look at right away. Nobody hates a bad cop worse than law enforcement. When we looked at what happened in Minnesota, our heart was broken because we knew that law enforcement all over the country would be painted with that. And fortunately, the sheriffs participate in an elected process, and it can't be tolerated. I mean, if it is, that's an automatic situation where the sheriff, would be reelected or unelected at the next election. But there are some items that I think the General Assembly should be looking at. One is there are only 2 or 3 areas where an officer can be decertified, and it has to do with drug use, and it has to do with conviction of a felony. That ought to be expanded. And I think you could take a good look at that and expand the areas where an officer could be decertified, as long as there are some protections for the officer, so that there are no unfunded accusations included in that. I've seen language on a duty to intervene by fellow law enforcement officers. That's excellent. We can support that. We do support that. I've seen the workings of the crisis intervention training that sheriffs and local police participate in, and it works. I mean, what you've done is we've educated the sheriffs and the police. We've exposed them to mental health issues, and they are responding to calls with that in mind. And I've seen so many compliments from sheriffs that participated in CIT that we need to expand it. So the accreditation touches on many of the items that everyone's talking about. And one of the items, if you're an accredited agency, there are mechanisms where the public can complain on an officer's behavior. It's dealt with according to the policies of the agency, but they have to meet certain standards if they are to be accredited. So the General Assembly has recognized accreditation, and there are many, many sheriffs that are accredited, but not all. And there's a little bit of salary stipend for sheriffs that participate in accreditation, and that should be looked at also.
Delegate Price, you're recognized. Delegate Price?
Unmute.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Delegate Simon. I wanted to ask Mr. Chairman of Mr. Jones, I want to make sure that I was not hearing ill-timed humor with regard to the Citizen Review Board. Is your answer to a suggestion of a Citizen Review Board that every 4 years the sheriff is elected by the public, and so that's the answer, or is it just you all do not support Citizen Review Boards?
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, let me respond by saying there are a number of sheriffs that have review boards and participate in the use of force and other issues that sheriffs deal with. We are not saying that just because a sheriff is elected, that there's not an appropriate place for some type of review committee, but if you have a citizen review board that has authority to oversee an elected official, that would create an unanticipated consequence. Because what you would have then, if you have a sheriff and then think about it, he just wins the election. Now there's a citizen review board, and I can picture a situation where all of his opponents, maybe the people he defeated or the people that want to run against him next time, or the people that want to be sheriff coming up, they're going to clamor to get on the citizen review board. So it takes on a little bit of a different approach than it would for other law enforcement agencies. And that's our concern with it, is that there would be unintended consequences related to a citizen review board.
Mr. Chairman, follow up very quickly.
Delegate Price.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So then, Mr. Jones and Mr. Chairman, what would be some changes that could be made such that outside entities would be able to have input? By virtue of the fact that sheriffs are elected, I don't think that means that they have, that they should be immune to being critiqued, especially if their work is within the community. So what would be an outside entity that could have some subpoena power or ability to do investigation should there be misbehavior, potentially deadly misbehavior going on a force?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to respond by saying this. When there is a situation in a sheriff's office in which force was used, in which it's excessive, and there needs to be an investigation, the sheriff used an independent and unrelated another law enforcement agency to investigate it, and it goes to the Commonwealth Attorney for review. I don't know what a citizen review board would do in addition to that. If there's a crime that's committed, and if the sheriff is, say, in a city or in a county where there's where he does law enforcement, first you've got the local law enforcement. In the case of the sheriff of the city, you've got the Virginia State Police that can investigate sheriffs, and they do when there's wrongdoing. You've got the FBI, you've got the Department of Justice. There's layer after layer of investigations that can take place with sheriffs.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and have to wrap it up. If I know other members are in the queue and want to ask questions, and we can get those questions to John, and maybe he can get a written response to some of those questions. Before I move to the next speaker, and thank you, Mr. Jones, for your time and being here today. We value your opinion.
Thank you very much.
Before we move on to the next speaker, I do want to acknowledge that Speaker Eileen Fillercorn is joining the public, and she's listening in on what we're doing, and I certainly want to acknowledge her giving us the opportunity and encouraging us to have this public forum. Thank you for her leadership to make this possible. So let's go ahead and move on to the next speaker, which is Dr. Lindsay Cohen. Dr. Cohen, are you there? And the floor is yours, and welcome, and thank you for being here.
Hi, Mr. Chair. Yes, thank you. I'm here. My name is Lindsay Cohen. I'm an associate professor in the National Security Affairs Department at the U.S. Naval War College. And I just want to mention that everything I say here is my own opinion and does not represent the views of either the U.S. Naval War College or any organ of the U.S. government. If we can go to the slideshow. Okay. Well, while we're waiting for the slideshow to come up, I will just start. My presentation today is going to be a little bit about militarized policing and the reforms that we are aware of. Thank you. You can go to the second slide. And I do want to note that I am speaking in generalizations as an academic who studies these things. I am not speaking specifically about Virginia policing. And I recognize that there are some departments that do these things already and others that do not. So I just want to point that out. And I want to start. Somebody's not muted. I do want to start by pointing out that the research shows that if the goal of policing is to deter lawbreaking, to have peaceful law-abiding communities, then punishment and deterrence by punishment are not actually the best mechanisms. People obey the law and cooperate with legal authorities if and when they view those authorities as legitimate. And this goes back to something that Delegate Scott said earlier, and I think I will come back to that point. It's really important that we understand that policing is embedded in a larger system. And as Colonel Settle pointed out, there are many good policies in place, but then as Delegate Scott pointed out, good policies are not everything. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to go quickly through the idea of what militarized policing is so that we can talk about what aspects of it are negative and what might be positive. And there are three areas of what we think of as militarized policing: culture and tactics, equipment, and professionalization or organization. I'll go through each of those. Next slide, please. So culture and tactics, and this, by the way, is, again, something Delegate Scott mentioned, and I think, and many researchers think, is probably the most important aspect. And what we mean by a militarized culture is this attitude that force or deterrence by punishment are effective ways to deal with a wide range of problems. So an example of tactics would be SWAT teams, trained and structured like Special Operations Forces units, and then order maintenance policing, which you all may know as stop and frisk. You may have heard of things like the broken windows theory of policing. These sorts of aggressive policing of either minor infractions or even sort of proactive actions like stop and frisk. These are all examples of types of policing that might that might demonstrate a militarized culture. Next slide, please. Then there's the equipment side. This was obviously in the news quite a bit in terms of the weapons and vehicles, and especially with the events in Portland, the uniforms and gear aspect, when the police forces have military equipment. This can be a sign of militarized policing. And it's important to note, the research indicates that the weapons and uniform are not helpful to policing outcomes. They do not seem to improve officer safety. They do not seem to improve citizen safety. They do not seem to lower crime very much. Although I should point out that the research, there is a debate still in the research, but the balance of the research indicates that these things do not help much. Vehicles such as MRAPs and other armored personnel carrier type things may have some deterrent effect on crime as a signal of police presence, but there's no real evidence to indicate that simple, normal marked police vehicles would not have the same effect. Next slide, please. And then finally, an aspect of militarization is professionalization and organization. And this is the aspect that much research indicates can actually be helpful, but then again, it depends on the content. If the training is appropriate, it can improve policing. Standardization is really important for oversight and accountability. Again, as multiple delegates have pointed out, it's important that the public have access to information about possible violations of policy or protocol. Obviously, having a professional ethic and standards, both Colonel Settle and Mr. Jones indicated that they take the idea of a professional ethic and standards seriously. That's important. And then hierarchy and accountability. If accountability internal to the organization is strong, then hierarchy can be good. However, if power is used to protect those who make errors and misbehave, a sort of circle the wagons approach, this can actually make things worse. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what type of policing works? According to the research, the most important things to make policing work, by which I mean to lower crime, to improve officer safety, and to improve general citizen satisfaction with the state of law enforcement, is it needs to be legitimate, it needs to be de-escalatory, and it needs to be accountable. Next slide, please. So what are some reforms and how do you think about reforms in general? As I mentioned, policing is embedded in a larger structure and culture. As Delegate Scott said, having good policies is simply not enough. There are larger things that need to be addressed, especially by an assembly such as this one. Laws need to be just. Justice needs to be affordable. Government must be transparent and accountable so that the people can see what's happening. And policing must be oriented toward the rights and safety of the whole community, and the community must perceive it to be so. There is a whole movement called the procedural justice movement. Yale Law School has an entire project on this where they have set up police training to help police departments all around the country implement procedural justice principles, which are basically treating people with dignity and respect, giving people voice during encounters with police, making decisions neutral, and conveying trustworthy motives. This also has a lot to do with the idea of community policing, where police officers get to know their community and interact with them in many ways other than just enforcement. Next slide, please. So what I've done here on these slides, and I won't go through all of them in respect of the Assembly's time, what I've done on these slides, and I hope you will get access to them, is list a number of reforms that I believe, based on my research and the research of others who do this, could all be very useful. I will just point out a couple that I think are very important. We've heard mention of police academies a couple of times, and there is a lot of research on this. One of the things that it's important to do at the beginning of a police officer's career is to make sure that they are socialized into the idea that crime is not necessarily best met with force and threat. That crime is a complex phenomenon, which I'm sure every law enforcement officer knows, that needs to be dealt with in terms of figuring out what's going on. And this comes into play in a lot of the things that we've talked about, such as broken windows theory of crime. There are lots of reasons why low-level crime might be happening, and treating it as a sort of precursor to high-level crime can actually backfire. The other point on this slide that I really want to emphasize is about recruiting. Colonel Settle mentioned recruiting, Mr. Jones mentioned recruiting. It is really important to make sure recruiting screens out potential abuses of authority, and I think that we saw that there are procedures in place for that. But what I did hear from Colonel Settle's presentation was a lot of things that would disqualify from joining a police force many people who had grown up in poverty, for example. And recruiting really should aim at greater diversity in terms of race and ethnicity, of course, gender, sexual orientation. One of the issues in militarized policing culture is a concern about hypermasculinity, by which I do not mean masculinity is bad or men are bad, but that hypermasculinity focuses on an idea of power and overpowering problems. So it's good to have diversity in all kinds of ways. Next slide, please. Okay, and then some structural reforms. Again, I just want to highlight one or two of these. The first one is to encourage, by which I mean help, communities and municipalities spend money on prevention and care as opposed to just enforcement. I do not mean that you have to abolish police or anything like that. It's important that police still feel they have adequate resources for their mission. But it is important to have other resources available to deal with, for example, mental health issues, poverty issues, homelessness, drug, etc. The other one I want to highlight here is to have a database of police misconduct and expand public access to those records. It is really important that the public be able, within the confines of the necessary privacy rights, that the public be able to know what kind of misconduct is going on. Again, the idea of police legitimacy relies, at least in part, on the belief that the police will recognize misconduct and will do something about it. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm just going to mention this. You can follow it up, or I can follow it up for you. There is a set of researchers out there who have put together these reforms called 8 Can't Wait. My mentioning these does not indicate endorsement of their entire agenda, but these 8 reforms are very simple, pretty easy to implement, and have evidentiary basis for reducing violence in interactions between police and the public. The big ones, and I know that several Virginia cities and municipalities already have some of these, but very few have all of them. And so it's helpful to look at the possibility of implementing some of these. Next slide, please. And then finally, I would just point out a number of the issues that we have heard about today already run up against the fact that police unions, in many cases, spend more lobbying money than even other really big name lobbying organizations, and they always outspend social justice organizations. That's just, they have more resources and they spend more resources. And this sometimes leads to legislative frameworks, especially contracting, police contract structure, where the police or the police unions are privileged over sort of the normal rules. And again, I am not an expert on the Virginia situation, so I'm not accusing anyone of anything right here. I'm just pointing out that as a general rule, it is important to have transparency for the public about where lobbying money is coming from and what it's aimed at. Next slide, please. Okay, we can. I can stop here. I was not asked to speak about the National Guard at this particular meeting, so we can close that, Mr. Chair, and I can answer questions.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Cohn. Exceptional presentation. And just a reminder, all these presentations will be put on the website for member and the public view. Delegate Helmer, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair. I wanted to ask Dr. Cohn, one of the things that stood out in your presentation is you talked about standardization of police training. We have dozens of police academies here in Virginia with certification standards managed at the state level, but not inspection of those academies for whether they teach all of it. And I just wondered if that's in line with what you've seen as best practices.
Thank you. Yes, what I mean by standardization has to do with a number of things, both in terms of the police academy training, but also in terms of policies and best practices, simply so because, as you mentioned, And as we all know, law enforcement in the United States is highly fragmented. It's at the local level on the principle that law enforcement should be done at the lowest level possible. And that principle should be protected. But it does make sense to have some higher level at the state, in this case, standardization of certain practices, certain training and education requirements that ensure that citizens have a basic understanding of what they are interacting with and what they can and cannot or should and should not expect. So the standardization is partly to improve policies if they need it, but really primarily to help with citizen transparency.
Thank you. Delegate Levine, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Doctor, actually, to follow up on that question of citizen transparency, what do you think is the best practice when there's been a complaint as to police misconduct? And obviously, not all complaints are criminal acts, but if there is a complaint, what do you think is the best practice for when that complaint is closed, how the complainant is informed, how the public is informed, if there's a criminal investigation and it's closed, or if it's open? There's been some question about how those should be treated differently. What do you think is the best practice for informing the complainant and the public about the results of those investigations?
So I'm not an expert on this particular question, but I will point out it is important that police officers get due process. As we heard before, it is important that police officers feel they will get due process and not be subjected to sort of trial by media or trial by the public. However, it's also important that the public believe that they will be informed of what happened and why it happened. So I think that the best way to sort of square this circle is to have a system in which the public are informed in a broad sense, not with any details or anything that could allow them to sort of have a feeding frenzy on a police officer who is still being investigated, but that they are given confidence that they will be informed of the outcome and that they will have trust in the outcome. And part of that comes from doing this. Part of that comes from holding people accountable when they have, in fact, violated policies and procedures or laws, so that the public see that when someone breaks the law or when someone violates policy, something happens to hold them accountable.
Thank you. Delegate Wilt, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Doctor, at the beginning of your presentation, you made a comment, forgive me, I don't have exactly how you said it, but what I thought I heard you say was that people obey laws when they feel like the laws are legitimate. Could you expound on that a little bit? I mean, that's leaves a lot to the imagination, really.
What I mean by that is, in a rule of law society, ideally, people should not be forced to obey law by fear of punishment. They should be obeying the law because they believe that the society is set up in a fair, just way, and that the laws protect everyone equally. And they should obey the law because they believe that even if this particular law annoys them at this point in time, like a speed limit or something like that, they recognize that as a member of society, laws in general are good. Now, that doesn't mean there won't be people who need to be deterred. That doesn't mean there won't be people who will break the law. But it is, a state where people only obey the laws because they are terrified of punishment is by definition a police state. And that's not what we want. So what I mean by that is not, if I don't feel like this law is legitimate, I'm just not going to, I'm just going to ignore it. What I mean is a larger social issue. As we see right now with these protests, you have entire groups of society basically saying, look, we think this system is not fair and we want to see it changed. And so, we have a system that allows for that. We have a system of democracy that allows groups of people to say, we don't think this is fair and it should change. But if you have laws that seem to be consistently, negative for certain groups of people, or if you have law enforcement practices that seem to be consistently negative for certain groups of people, those groups of people will eventually just not respect those laws or those law enforcement officers anymore. It's important that the system adapt itself to how the people think they should be ruled.
Thank you, Dr. Cohn. Thank you, Delegate Wilt, for your question. I'm sorry I'm going to have to cut off the questions, but if members do have questions, they can submit to Dr. Cohn or any of the speakers, and I'd ask that those be written, those questions and answers be written back to the committee for all of us to see. So why don't we go ahead and move on to our next speaker. Thank you, Dr. Cohn, for your time. Our next speaker is Larry Boone. He's the Norfolk Chief of Police. Chief Boone, welcome. Thank you for being here today.
Well, good morning, and thank you all for having me. I appreciate the opportunity, Mr. Chairman, as well as Madam Herring, to speak with you all. This is a very, very important topic. I've been in law enforcement for 30 years, and I've seen this movement before, going back to Rodney King and Ferguson to where we currently are now. And I hope we don't just take this opportunity to celebrate the problem. I hope that there are measurable and meaningful outcomes through all this activity, and I'm sure that there will be. Next slide, please. So we're going to go through this rather quickly. The topics I'll be covering are the hiring practices or process, MPD's training requirements, Department of Criminal Justice Services decertification requirements, MPD's administrative terminations, and MPD's duty to report misconduct and duty to intervene. Next, please. So our hiring and background process, all applicants are thoroughly vetted through a multi-step process. The multi-step process comprised of a written exam, a background check, polygraph examination, physical examination, and psychological examination. We always start out anywhere with 300 to 400 applicants. By the time we get through those multiple processes, we have an academy somewhere between 25 to 35. And we end up graduating about 80% of that number. Our academy is very challenging. I don't necessarily trust any academy where you graduate everyone 100%. The Norfolk Police Department runs a very stringent police academy. And when someone tries to join our agency from another police department, we go to that applicant's agency and do a thorough investigation of their personnel files to ensure that we aren't embracing anyone into our organization that would not be a good fit. Next slide, please. So MPD's training requirement. DCJS requires 400 hours of basic law enforcement training for the initial certification. There are an awful lot of law enforcement agencies in the Commonwealth that just meet that standard there. The Norfolk Police Department, we do well over 1,000 hours, 27 weeks, and it includes a host of things to include critical incident training, a combination of defensive driving, defensive tactics, firearms, de-escalation, things of that nature. Before I go to the next slide, I also want to take an opportunity to address something that was mentioned earlier regarding diversity. The Norfolk Police Department is the most diverse police department in the state. And I don't say diversity just to say that. I mean diversity in means of inclusiveness as well, regarding those that have positions of policymaking. We have individuals of the LGBTQ plus community, Asians, African Americans, Hispanic, and leadership positions. So we are very, very well diverse, and we have people in positions that have input regarding policy. So decertification requirements for the state. There's a requirement within 48 hours for the parent law enforcement agency to contact DCJS and let them know that said officer shall be decertified. And some of the things that constitute decertifications involve a conviction of a felony, class 1 misdemeanor involving moral turpitude, including but not limited to petty larceny, and convicted of any misdemeanor involving sex, but not limited to sexual battery or consensual intercourse with a minor 15 years or older. Next slide, please. Continuing on with the automatic decertifications, are convicted of a domestic assault, of course, a failure to comply or maintain compliance with mandated training requirements, refusal to submit to a drug screening. That does happen from time to time, and that naturally is an automatic disqualifier. One of the things that the decertification process does not capture, an officer can be terminated from the Norfolk Police Department, and he or she could go to another agency if they were terminated for excessive force. Excessive force is not one of the automatic decertification incidents. I've seen far too often I will fire an officer for excessive force, and they are afforded to go to a neighboring agency, and clearly we have to be able to do something to put control measures in place to stop that. Next slide, please. So when we conduct our investigations, and it's been determined that an officer committed a serious offense, naturally we're going to seek termination to separate him or her from this department. I will say that, as I said earlier, unless an agency that that officer goes to does not inquire about why that officer left the Norfolk Police Department, that officer, in most cases, have gained employment unfettered. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So we have a duty to report personnel that are engaged in misconduct. And we highly stress that it is a requirement for an officer to ensure that they make us aware. They can do it anonymously, or they can make their complaint in person to Internal Affairs, the Office of Professional Standards. And it could be regarding misconduct, inadequate services, or anything of that nature. We try to stress, and I've seen this done at least 4 or 5 times since I've been here, officers turning in officers or highlighting bad behavior. Doesn't happen a whole lot, but it has happened. Next slide, please. A duty to intervene, that's been the topic of a lot of discussion, and we've had that in place for at least 5 or 6 years now, and it is what it is. You know, any officer, regardless of rank, present and observing an officer using force that is clearly something that, you know, that's unreasonable, we want to ensure that that officer intervenes. We just had an incident in which an officer was not using force, but it looked as though it was going to go that way, and an officer intervened, and thankfully that nothing else occurred from there on. But I'll say all that to say, and you see it for yourself, culture eats policy for lunch. That is something Delegate Scott alluded to, and it's been alluded to previously by someone else. And that's just the reality of what we do in some law enforcement agencies. And I can tell you it's something that has to change. We have to start by hiring the right people. No training in the world will change a person's heart. We have to hire the right people with the right heart for this job. As you've seen through body-worn camera footage, under conflict, you're going to be who you are. And body-worn camera footage has certainly showed us that. There needs to be standardized training as well as accreditation. The Norfolk Police Department is CALEA accredited. There's 18,000 police departments in the country. Only 4% are CALEA certified. CALEA is the gold standard. There's nothing wrong with LESI. However, CALEA, in my opinion, is the gold standard, and it's somewhat expensive. It's about $5,000 a year to maintain that status, but it's worth it. We need to create an officer termination database so that officers terminated from one department cannot go to another department and continue with their ways. The DCJS decertification process needs to include administrative investigation. Currently, it does not, to include those investigations surrounding excessive force and those officers deemed to be Brady Giglio. It's concerning to me. There are multiple agencies that have officers on the force deemed to be Brady Giglio, and some of those cases in which they were deemed to be Brady Giglio are concerning. I think an officer that lies will use excessive force. I yield my time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chief Boone. Appreciate your testimony. Delegate Sullivan, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chief Boone, thank you very much for your presentation. Frankly, I wanted to ask this question of Dr. Cohn, but having heard your remarks, it's probably better asked of you. You talk about recruitment, Colonel Settle, Mr. Jones all talked about recruitment, and when you started to talk about recruitment, what you talked about was weeding people out and who should not become law enforcement officers. The tests, the disqualifiers. I'm interested in what we're doing to find people who should be law enforcement officers. Recruitment isn't just what applications come over the transom, and I'd be interested in where your 500 applications come from. My real question is, what do you regard as best practices? What is your department doing to affirmatively go out and recruit and look for people who have the qualities that we need in law enforcement that would result in the kind of diversity that you have? How have you done that? Is that something you've done affirmatively, or do you just wait for it to happen?
Well, if you wait for it to happen, it's not going to happen. You have to be intentional. Yep. You have to be intentional and embrace and say things so folks that want to be police officers know that they're welcome. I highlight diversity because I want folks to look at us and say, well, there's an opportunity for me. I come from public housing. Though their police chief is an African American, he came from public housing. I have an African American that's an assistant chief. I have several African Americans and members of the LGBTQ plus community that are captains, sergeants, lieutenants, and corporals. We are very diverse because we've been intentional. How we weed out that 400 plus application, we put our applicants through a vigorous background investigation. If we find a hint of racism or anything like that, they're automatically disqualified. Once they make the academy, we intentionally put them through processes that if they have things that they've been able to suppress, we're going to bring it out of them in our crisis intervention class. We put them under stress to show who you are. As I said previously, under conflict, you are going to show who you are. And thus far, it's been working. I'm very, very proud of our diversity. Although the George Floyd incident, it's going to make it difficult for us because, quite frankly, I've been out here marching with these kids and talking with these kids, and there's not a real good feel for law enforcement, and that happened in Minneapolis, and unfortunately, we are paying for it here, and unfortunately, it won't be the last time. The George Floyds, It's nothing new. These things have happened in law enforcement for a very, very long time. But I will say this, we're better today than we were years ago, and we're going to get better tomorrow. But we still have work to do.
Mr. Chairman, I know we're crunched for time, but a really quick follow-up.
Go ahead, Delegate Sullivan, briefly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If you could just give us 30 seconds more, Chief, on what you mean when you say we're being intentional. Are you looking for recruits in different places than other departments? Are you going to different schools to recruit? Are you going to different neighborhoods to recruit? Are you looking for certain kinds of qualifications for potential officers? What do you mean when you say you're intentional about finding people who are going to be good cops as opposed to weeding out people who are going to be bad cops?
We are intentional in the sense that we're looking for good people at universities, the military, and neighborhoods, and we advertise our diversity. Okay, it's one thing to say it, it's another thing to see it. Okay, if you don't know, we have the Gay Pride parade here, as well as the Gay Pride function here once a year. And my officers that are part of that community, they go out there in uniform, and we don't hide who we are. We embrace it. We don't make anybody feel a certain way for being who they are. And when you show that, people believe that, and people are willing to join. I cannot tell you how many times I've heard that, I look at your department and I see opportunity for me. And one of the things we do is show our diversity, and it's been working. We got to hit the reset button, as I said previously, unfortunately, due to the George Floyd situation, but we'll recover because we tend to be very, very authentic in what we try to do. And we don't always get it right, but we get it right far often than we get it wrong.
Thank you, Chief. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the extra time.
Delegate Price, you have the last question, Delegate Price, for Chief Boone.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Chief Boone, for your eye-opening and enlightening testimony. I also heard you speak at Congressman Scott's roundtable, and I hope people will watch that and hear your comments on some of the front-end work that you all are doing to weed out the bad applicants. But my question, as part of that background information getting processed, is what do you understand as your ability to speak to other police chiefs such that even if they weren't decertified, let's say I'm in Newport News, right? Let's say there was a police officer that was fired or quit from Newport News and then sought to be a police officer in Norfolk. What is your understanding of the law and your ability to pick up the phone and call Police Chief Drew and have a conversation about an applicant before you were to hire?
Well, let me say this. The 7 city chiefs, we meet quarterly until the COVID virus situation occurred. There are some parameters in which I have to walk lightly in reporting that information. Unless the officer signs a waiver, that officer will probably be able to join the police department if the agency does not take a look at his file. In some cases, let me be just very clear with you, I will say you probably need to come take a look at his file. I won't get into the details of what the file says, but I would strongly urge that agency to take a look at that individual's file. I think I owe them that professional courtesy. Whether they take it or not, that's on them.
Thank you, Chief Boone. Thank you, Delegate. Okay. Thank you so much for your time, Chief. We really appreciate your testimony today. Moving on to our next speaker is Asha Khanna from American Civil Liberties Union. Asha, thank you for being here. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman, Madam Herring, and the members of the committee today. I appreciate the opportunity to have the ACLU speak. Can we bring up the PowerPoint presentation? while the PowerPoint is going up, I want to also echo some of the opening remarks that were said before me. I really do feel like this is an opportunity for meaningful accountability, an opportunity to show Virginians that action is possible. We have to rethink the nature of policing. It's not about us or them, but it's about the kind of Virginia that we want to see. And so I will be, my name is Ashna Kunda, and I'm the Legislative Director for the ACLU Virginia. And we also have Eden, our Legal Director, on with us today.
Hey, everybody.
Next slide. So why now, right? And so we know that the tragic murders of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and recent protests have shown urgent needs for fundamental changes in policing. Virginia needs change now. Virginians like Marcus David Peters and Natasha McKenna needed mental health services, but were instead killed by law enforcement. The killers have not been charged with a crime and are largely shielded from civil liability by Virginia laws. Next slide. Black and brown people in Virginia continue to suffer injuries and die at the hands of police, yet police escape accountability. What I'll be talking about today is about how we can pass a bill that creates a state cause of action and addresses decertification for misconduct that answers the calls of Virginians who are demanding accountability for officers who use their power to harm Black and brown people without consequences, often keeping their jobs and continuing their lives, and as while Black and brown families mourn the loss of their loved ones. Next. So what can we do? Qualified immunity. Next. All right, so qualified immunity is a legal defense that sets a very high bar for when a police officer is legally responsible for damage that they cause to another person. For an officer to be responsible, they must have violated a clearly established right of the individual. And in practice, courts have found very few rights clearly established. I want to expand a little bit more on this doctrine. It's essentially a free pass for police officers to violate constitutional rights without being held to account. Ordinary people, whether they're doctors, lawyers, or construction workers, are expected to follow the law. If they violate someone else's legal rights, they can be sued and required to pay for injuries they've caused. Under this doctrine of qualified immunity, police officers are held to a much lower standard. Today we hear about police shooting after police shooting, where police officers are rarely, if ever, held accountable by the criminal legal system, either because prosecutors decline to charge or because juries decline to convict. Qualified immunity takes away the other avenue that victims of police violence should have available to hold police accountable. Next slide, please. Again, so this doctrine is especially powerful and limits lawsuits and damages in federal courts in many states as well. I want to re-emphasize why it really is an issue. So first and foremost, qualified immunity means that we can't get relief in court, right? And so this means that officers have little incentive to improve their practices and follow the law. This ultimately undermines the safety and justice for everyone, and particularly people of color who are vulnerable and more likely to be a target of the police. Additionally, qualified immunity doesn't just reduce a person's chance for victory in a civil rights suit, it means claims will not be brought in the first place. Next, please. So what's the solution? So that could look like creating accountability for Virginia police with a new state cause of action. Since federal law in this area is so weak, allowing police to escape accountability, some states have passed laws that expressly allow people to sue the police when they injure or kill someone. These laws create a cause of action against police in the state, which is a legal term for when you're allowed to sue someone. Next slide, please. So, what we must do is pass a similar law here in Virginia that will create a cause of action to challenge police violence throughout the state, allowing people to sue state and local police and state courts when their rights are violated. And so we have this kind of language drafted, right? And what this would look like is adding a section to Virginia Code and striking out existing immunity clauses in the code. It's a pretty simple bill, less than 2 pages. Next slide, please. Our law must specifically state that qualified immunity is not a defense to these lawsuits, so police no longer have this legal shield to hide behind. A state cause of action will allow Virginians or their families to receive damages when they're hurt or killed by police violence. What this would look like is amending the Virginia Tort Claims Act or enacting, like I said, a new statute that would allow individuals to bring action. I know that, we kind of talked about the legislation being drafted. I also want to mention that we have legislative champions, such as Delegate Bourne and others, and community partners who are championing such legislation. I also want to address, earlier in the presentation, the Virginia Sheriff Association mentioned the worry that passing such a bill would bring about many frivolous lawsuits against police officers. This is actually an inaccurate assumption when we look at studies across this country. Attorney fees and costs will be awarded to the police if it is found to be a frivolous lawsuit and vice versa. We don't need more studies. Other states have passed such bills already. This justification ignores the reality that such costs are virtually always either paid by the officer's municipality, insurance, or unions. And studies have really said again and time that individual officers almost never paid such costs. Next slide, please. So something that I really want to emphasize and something that I appreciate and respect about Virginia, its legislators, its community members, is that we intentionally think through the policies that are best for Virginia and the policies that are best locally. So this is exactly what passing a state cause of action bill would mean. It would mean that we would have our legal rights of Virginians decided by Virginia courts with Virginia judges and Virginia juries. It's one of the best ways to do it. Next slide, please. All right, so strengthening and expanding the decertification statute. I was excited to hear earlier, actually, that the Virginia State Police, Virginia Sheriff's Association, and Chief Boone have all expressed interest and solidarity in this. So I won't go over any of the details that have already been said, but we'll expand on what potential legislation may look like. Next slide, please. So all already talked about is, kind of the statute that would cover all felony and certain misdemeanor convictions involving moral turpitude. The failure to maintain such training requirements and the failure of a drug test is what decertification currently looks like in Virginia. Like a doctor losing their license to practice medicine or an attorney being disbarred, once decertified, an officer can no longer serve as a law enforcement officer in Virginia. Next, please. So I want to kind of say, what is the impact? Why should Virginia take this on now? So Virginia has only decertified 33 officers, while other states have done thousands. According to the Virginia Association Chiefs of Police, our statute allows officers who are fired by one agency for misconduct to be hired by others. This happens frequently and is quite unfortunate, especially when there's issues with officer integrity, lying, violations of departmental policies as well. Police feel immune from consequences, and stories like this should worry us all. The reality is that once unethical behavior or misconduct happens and someone is fired, let go, or resigned, they are usually hired by another police department. This is only a temporary way of removing a bad cop. I also want to state that we've only certified 13 officers since 2016, and we know that's not the reality of where we should be. So we know the statistics, so it's time to expand decertification and include unnecessary use of force and unethical misconduct. The 3 states that make up majority of nationwide decertifications are Georgia, North Carolina, and Florida. One of the reasons that this is because they have professional standards of conduct that promote stronger and more varied grounds for decertification. Next. So what needs to change? So 1, I think we need to expand the grounds, and 2, we need to put statewide statewide standards for everyone. I think that one of the things that usually comes up is, policing is not a one-size-fits-all. I think we can all agree that everyone deserves fair and equitable treatment, no matter what the zip code they live in. Standards to ensure uniformity, just like this, and in any other professional job, all must abide by state standards. So police should not be different. Next. So I'm going to kind of, I know that time is running near, so conclusion, I think this is possible. It's feasible, and I'd like to say why. Next. I'm going to quickly quote two family members who have lost their dear ones to police brutality, and also then talk more about the coalitions that are fighting for both bills. So to quote Princess Blanding, we need police accountability and not just statue removal. I feel like as hurt as my family and I are, as hurt as I'm sure Mr. Floyd's family is, that our brothers were sacrificed to get us to the next level of the civil rights movement, and that we still have so far to go. We must get rid of qualified immunity and implement broader decertification standards. Next. Can we get to the next slide, please? And here's a statement from Earl Lewis. Black Lives Matter. My name is Earl Lewis, the cousin of William Chapman. On April 22nd, 2015, William was 18 years old when he was shot and killed in a Walmart parking lot in Portsmouth, Virginia. William's life mattered. The truth is, the police officer should have been decertified long before this incident, and although he was found guilty of manslaughter, that did not do justice to my family or William. William was hoping to obtain a high school diploma and potentially enter the military like I did. He was shot in the head and it broke my heart. He was shot in the chest and it broke my heart. I have served 20 years as a firefighter and 13 years as a sergeant in the United States Army, willing to give my life for my country. How is it that an unarmed 18-year-old cousin, my unarmed 18-year-old cousin, was killed? Please get rid of qualified immunity and expand decertification standards. Please don't let another William pass away or any other unarmed black man because we did not change the laws to hold police accountable. Next. And so here's a slide kind of all the coalition and groups across Virginia that are in support of these two bills. And so we really do have the momentum behind us. We do have the community behind us, and we know that these are two laws that would really make a huge impact when we think about police accountability in Virginia. Virginia is looking for us to lead in this moment, and that means taking positive action, individually and collectively, to make changes in the laws, policies, practices, and police culture that have allowed for murders to happen. We already have drafted bills. We have legislative champions, many of which are sitting in this committee right now. And as a collective, I truly believe that we can make change. I want to thank Leader Herring and Delegate Hope again so much for the opportunity to speak. You both have been champions of bills and police reform in the past, and I look forward to working with everyone on the committee and all legislators to really work together with community members to get these passed.
Thank you. Thank you for that excellent testimony. Delegate Mullen, nice.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ashna, it is always good to see you, and I appreciate all the hard work that you guys have been doing with us over in the Criminal Law Subcommittee. I had a more general question based on your decertification bill. In looking at some of the DCJS standards, first for new recruits as well as for ongoing certifications, I have not been terribly impressed by some of the DCJS standards that we already currently have. So to give teeth to not particularly impressive standards is only one part of it. Do you or organizations within your coalition have some suggestions about how we can improve some of the DCJS standards that are already existing?
The short answer is yes, we do. And we would love to work with legislators like yourself to really expand on that and really do put some teeth behind that. Eden, is there anything that we'd like to add at this moment? Yeah.
No, nothing on that end. But yeah, I think that's definitely going to be something that we build upon as we develop.
Thank you, Delegate Mullen. And thank you, Ms. Canna. There are no other questions from members, so we thank you for your time and being here today. We really appreciate your testimony. Next speaker is Colonel Maggie DeBoard. Colonel DeBoard is the Herndon Chief of Police. Colonel DeBoard, thank you. Welcome for being here. We appreciate you coming this morning. Still morning. It's afternoon.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair Hope and Chair Herring. I am Maggie DeBoard. I am the Chief of Police for the town of Herndon. I'm also the first Vice President for the Virginia Association of Chiefs of Police and also their incoming president. I really thank you for your time today. I do not have a PowerPoint, which I'm actually happy about at this point because I can, going last, I think, in the order. I don't want to be repetitive, overly repetitive of what's been said, but I certainly, want to speak directly to you and the other members of the committee about the issues today. Reform is critically important to us at the Virginia Chiefs of Police, and we have actually been proactively working on this issue for many months, and we want to be part of that meaningful reform with the goal of increasing our professionalism and our standards across the state. That's really our mission. We were the first to come to the table offering initial proposals for change that we presented to the governor on June 7th. And we also sent our initial report to the General Assembly on our recommendations, which we hope to build on with much of the discussion today. I will say that I truly align myself with many of the comments that Colonel Settle and Chief Boone have already talked about, but there are several key areas that we feel as Virginia Chiefs that we can see reform having a significant effect on professionalizing policing and really strengthening accountability. And that's, I think, largely what we're talking about, professionalizing our standards and accountability and increasing that accountability throughout all of our agencies. The first step for that, for us, is truly accreditation. There are currently 130 out of 365 agencies in Virginia that are accredited either through LESI, the state-sponsored accreditation, or through CALEA, which is our national accreditation. Regardless of which way an agency goes, we truly feel that it should be the goal of every law enforcement agency in the state to achieve accreditation. Many of the policies that we're talking about that we want to legislate, bias-based policing, duty to intervene, use of force, all of these policies, hiring standards and practices, they are part of that accreditation process. So in order to be accredited, you have to have those types of policies in place within your agency. We do, although accreditation is a part of that, we do feel that some things, truly do need to be legislated. But just as a starting point, if you're accredited, you will already have progressive policies in place because you have to come up with review every 4 years in order to be accredited. So we should keep in mind that, as you all well know, accreditation does not come cheaply. Even through the state accreditation, even though there's not a cost for that, there is a significant cost of staff time to put those things together. So that's a starting point for us, and that should be overarching about everything that we do. So one of the things that the decertification statute. Not only do we agree with strengthening decertification and hiring standards within the state, we actually have already been in front of this issue, and we have already proposed legislation to strengthen that certification. There is nothing more frustrating from a chief standpoint to fire an officer or have an officer resign in lieu of termination only to see that officer go to another agency and be hired. It's a very frustrating place for us, and oftentimes we have officers or agencies who don't even contact us about a prior employee, and so we don't have the ability to speak. But our decertification statute really is based almost entirely on criminal, and most of the time we don't lose officers based on criminal. They're based on integrity violations or use of force patterns or bias patterns or performance issues. So our legislation, which we've actually sent to Senator Serval and Senator Locke this morning, we'd also see that include not only just termination of an officer for a Brady violation, which are integrity, truthfulness violations, excessive force, either a single egregious incident or maybe a pattern of smaller incidents, or bias-based thing. We would like to see that included, but not just termination, but anybody who resigns in lieu of termination, so that we have that ability to put that decertification in the process. The other part of that is changes are going to be needed to the hiring and background process. We need to legislate that employers, and we have also proposed this already, employers who are trying to hire a certified officer or an officer who left another agency should be required to go to that previous agency based on a release from the applicant and look at those files. One of the other problems that we have had in the past is some law enforcement agencies do not willingly open their training files, their personnel files, and their disciplinary records to us. We need full access to those if we are going to hire an officer from another agency. Those things we are proposing that they be legislated. Part of the background too, and we want to thank Delegate Price for her previous work on trying to get a hiring standard, passed but we really want to continue to work with her and you all to make this a reality, because we need to legislate certain pieces of that background process so that we can ensure that we are getting the right people. And as Chief Boone spoke about, and I always say to everybody, my main goal is to bring the right people in the door and to ensure that the wrong people go out the door. And this is where you all can help us with legislation. I don't know a chief who is not committed to that process, but we need to do it right and ensuring that the process is there, but we balance the rights of the officer through an appeal so that they have a right to that. The other part of that hiring background part, there should be a requirement to check the decertification list in Virginia, because we want to make sure employers are checking that to ensure that officers that have been decertified, that they are checking that database. And we have a lot of work to do on that, but we're looking forward to working with you all on that. Some of the issues that I want to hit on quickly that really have not been talked about, and that is the response to mental illness. I don't think you'll find a police officer anywhere that would like to probably pull back on some of the calls that we have to go on to. But in reality, right now, the only people available to deal with many of these calls when people are in emotional crisis are called police. And CIT training, the crisis intervention training, is truly, truly important to us. And even if we develop other response models, we have to maintain our training for police officers and sheriffs on crisis intervention, because oftentimes we don't know what we're going to, or that is a part of another larger criminal issue that we are dealing with. What we would like to see on the Virginia Chiefs Association is a development of a co-response model, where you pair a crisis intervention counselor or social worker with a police officer or sheriff, so that the safety piece of that response is embedded there. That if the badge is a turnoff and it causes a bigger problem, we can step in the background. If safety's a preeminent issue, we can step forward in that background. But that would allow us the ability to handle those more effectively, more efficiently, and hopefully in a much more de-escalated manner. So that is what we would like to see happen. That is a funding issue, and we're hoping maybe that can be looked at the regional level to best utilize the funds that may be available to jurisdictions. But we have no problem with diverting calls to other areas, and let us focus on the true criminal issues. A couple things I want to hit on too, just really quickly about the militarization of police that was talked about earlier. In my opinion, and I speak for myself, but I know I speak for many chiefs, what I wear, what equipment I carry, is not as important as really what is militarizing police. Really, what will cure that is how communities view the police is not based on what I wear and what I carry. It's based on the relationships that I've established with my community and the trust that I've earned very hard. But we have to be careful about balancing that as well with the active shooter incidents and the other high risk areas that law enforcement officers have to go to. We have to create that balance. But it really starts with the relationships. If the relationships aren't there, that viewpoint is going to come to the forefront. Regarding training is critical to us. We have already pushed out a bias-based policing online module available for every law enforcement officer in the state of Virginia through the VACP training portal. That is an excellent training that is free to all of our police officers around the state, and we actively have people engaging in that. And we are looking to put together, actually we have put together, although it has not been formalized and put out yet, a certification for law enforcement leaders and commanders, because we truly believe that leadership is important. And I want to speak just briefly, and I know my time is almost out here, but directly to Delegate Scott, and I think Delegate Bourne spoke about culture. Culture is critical to our agencies, and we are looking to develop a culture of professional service, of accountability, of transparency, and integrity, fairness, and compassion. That is really what we need to continue to develop. The VACP is committed to that. We are working on that through our certification program and online training, and that'll be pushed out more and more as we go through. But we couldn't agree more on putting those training pieces in place and standardizing those high-risk areas like decertification, use of force, those areas across the state, especially those high-risk areas, so we can see some standardization in that approach. And I be respectful of your time and the other committee members. I will yield the floor now to you for any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Colonel DeBorg. Thank you for that testimony. You did mention that you sent some legislation on decertification to the Senate. I'd ask
Yes,
that you
sir.
do the same to Leader Herring and myself. We'd like to take a look at what you're proposing specifically.
Absolutely.
I appreciate you doing that. Are
I
there
think
questions?
that's
Yeah, thank you for that. Are there questions? Delegate Wilt, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Colonel, you mentioned during your presentation that you would be happy to transfer calls to others. And I took that in what you were talking about with healthcare professionals. So can you walk me through that process that, what happened, 911 call comes into your department. What criteria do you or your staff use to say, this is a mental health, we'll send them or we need to go? Can you help me with that?
Well, right now we don't have any other options, but what we tried to do based on the scenario is send an officer who's fully trained and has been to the advanced crisis intervention training. That's our first goal. If we know that there is a emotional crisis response involved, sometimes because I work in a smaller community, we know our community very, very well here. So sometimes we'll adapt response based on somebody who's had great success dealing with that individual that may be on duty. We have resources we can call to work with us, but they're not readily available. We do work with providers when we can, but our goal is to get on scene and provide the resources necessary to get that person help. It is strictly to do that. And sometimes we can make phone calls, we can make connections via phone with crisis counselors. That's an easy piece for us. Other times it involves us taking physical custody of somebody and transporting them somewhere to get the help that they need. Most of the time it's us trying to de-escalate the situation, stabilizing that situation, and then getting the help or resources to them or to a family member to make sure that everybody stays safe.
Thank you, Colonel DeBorg. Are there other questions? Delegate Price, you're recognized.
Yes, thank you, Colonel. Piggybacking off, and Mr. Chairman, piggybacking off Delegate Wilt's question, is there a mechanism, maybe if you've heard of the proposed Marcus alert, that the family could use if they were with someone that was going through a crisis to let someone know ahead of time what type of crisis it was that might be able to differentiate between when someone feels like they're in danger from someone that's doing it on purpose as opposed to someone who may be in crisis, and if that's on the front end of letting someone know, what's going on. And then on the back end, can you just tell us a little bit about some of the other forms of training that you may have as it pertains to mental health, but also those that might be under the influence of a substance or have developmental disabilities? Can you talk a little bit about that once you all respond?
Yeah, so the first part about the family calling in, it's really critical if a family member is actually making contact with a 911 center to communicate the details of what may happening. But keep in mind that our goal is the safety of everyone, including that person in crisis, not just the people around them or us by any means, it's including that person in crisis. And oftentimes we're hampered by not having enough information on different people. We've talked about for our communities, putting special needs registries on file for people that we deal with frequently in the community. We have been looking at that here in Herndon. So let's say there's somebody who has autism that we deal with frequently, but maybe somebody doesn't know that if we have a voluntary registry or somebody can register about somebody who's in need, we know a little more about that person. That's an idea we have come up with here locally to look at. But whatever information we can get from the family would be critical. If they are calling a 911 center, that means there is a significant concern for safety and we would be dispatched. If we're in a co-response model, then we would have the crisis intervention counselors with us that would help us not to become the primary in that event. Sometimes it might take a team, both of us, to deal with the safety issues and the emotional crisis at one time. But the more information we have up front, the better. So communication is key in that. And training our dispatchers to ask those questions is also key to that. The other part you talked about the training. CIT training covers a wide breadth of different types of needs and problems. And it's not just somebody who's in emotional crisis for an issue. It might be special needs, disabilities. All those things play a part, but there are different trainings for dealing with autism. There are different trainings for people who deal with Down syndrome or other parts. People who are victims. There's all types of things out there, and that training is critical, and that ongoing training is necessary. So we have to look at the full breadth of that and know what resources are available, but more importantly, officers have to have immediate access to those resources in order to utilize them, because time is often of the essence for us to be able to basically stabilize the situation until we can get more help there.
Delegate Bourne, you have a question. Delegate Bourne, you recognize?
Comment or record.
Delegate Bourne. Delegate Bourne, do you wish to be recognized?
Yes, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you just fine.
All right, perfect. Colonel, this is less of a question, or I guess it's a request, so it might be a question. One of the things that I'm working on for this August 18th special session is trying to codify the exact type of bilateral response, and Delegate Price referenced the Marcus alert. And so I guess my request would be if my office could reach out to you to sort of get some ideas about what that might look like. We certainly have been working with lots of stakeholders on this, most notably Princess Blanding and Marcus Peters' family members and some groups down here. But I'd love to get your perspective if you make yourself available.
Absolutely. I'd be happy to work with you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I don't see any more questions. Thank you very much, Colonel DeBoer. Appreciate your presentation, your testimony today. Let's move on to the next panel of speakers. The next four speakers will have 5 minutes apiece. The first is Delegate Lamont Bagby from the Virginia Legislative Black Caucus. Delegate Bagby, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, we can.
Hello?
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and morning to the members of the Courts of Justice and Public Safety Committees. Thank you for affording me an opportunity and a moment to address the joint committee. I echo the Chair's urgency of action. I'm anxious to see what we may accomplish together. I really believe that this is our moment. This is our opportunity. For decades, there's no question that the members of the Virginia Legislative Black Caucus have been working to break down systems of oppression, including working to reframe the ways that the state government approaches public safety. I trust that each of you have had an opportunity to review the VLBC's priorities that we released over a month ago. During the special session, you can expect the VLBC plans to introduce legislation to deliver on our promises. I have confidence that you will give these agenda items the attention that they deserve, and quite frankly, the attention that the citizens of the Commonwealth demand. And I think that's showing up with the time that's being spent on these issues today. I know that you will continue to have a partner in members of the VLBC as we focus on the agenda that we have released, and that's showing up again by, I've been listening to all the conversation and discussion, and I've been impressed with the questions and the dialogue, including that of VLBC members. And a sincere thank you for the opportunity to allow me and so many others that are passionate about addressing these inequities to speak. I'm not going to get into details about the items on the VLBC priority list. Hopefully that everyone has had an opportunity again to view those. If you in fact have information that will be valuable to us as we process it, whether that's something that is supportive or it improves the legislation that we plan to put forward, I would encourage you to respond to us via email so that we can make sure that we note your suggestions. And so, again, to the chairs and the members of the committee, I appreciate you all taking the time not only to listen to me, but also to hear from others.
Thank you, Delegate Bagby. I really appreciate it. Thank you for your leadership. We're going to make certain that if those in the public have not seen, I'm sure that members have, but that those of the public who haven't seen the Virginia Legislative Black Caucus list of suggestions and recommendations, that we make sure we put that on the website, just like we're putting the presentations, so the public can see those recommendations. And thank you for your leadership. Are there any questions for Delegate Bagby? All right. Thank you, Delegate Bagby. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Our
next speaker is Marquise Hunt, who's the Chairman Emeritus from the National NAACP. Marquise Hunt, are you here? And thank you for being here. Marquise Hunt, are you there?
I am here. Can you hear?
I can hear you.
Okay. Good morning to the chairs and the esteemed members of this committee. My name is Marquise Hunt. I'm a community activist, organizer, and chairman emeritus of the National NAACP Youth and College Division Task Force. While I count it an honor and privilege to share comments on an issue that not only affects me, but an issue that so many people who I have had the pleasure of listening to and learning from by dedicating their entire lives to reform, dismantle, and rebuild the systems seen to oppress our communities. It is unfortunate that in the midst of a pandemic, where the number of people who are contracting COVID-19 are increasing, that we too have to deal with the alarming but somewhat normalized increase of Black and brown bodies being slaughtered at the hands of law enforcement officers. Instances of police brutality and excessive force have become an all too common reoccurrence in cities throughout the United States, with a disproportionate and devastating impact on Black and brown communities. Virginia is not immune to these unjustified and heinous acts being committed against our citizens, and we suffer the social fallout all the same. As a nation, we face a dire situation as the traditional police model of protect and serve, which never truly garnered a sense of trust in Black neighborhoods. It has lost even more support and respect in recent years. Still worse is a growing sentiment amongst law enforcement that the public has abandoned them, returning us to the antiquated and deplorable policing mantra of us versus them. In 2016, this body progressively moved to pass House Bill 301 that increased transparency around officer-involved shootings that resulted in death or serious injury, and expanded the state's ability to monitor these officers and public engagement statewide. Due to this system, to date, we now know that since 2016, there have been 91 officer-involved shootings in the state of Virginia. However, a troubling fact that emerged was that only one of these shootings was declared unjustified. Even more troubling, as discovered through the 2016 investigative reporting of the Lynchburg News in Advance, was that almost 30% of the state's major shootings were not reported to the state as required by the 2016 law. The reporting has improved over the years. These findings clearly highlight the importance of promoting legislation that builds upon HERE systems, which ultimately helps us to develop better and more comprehensive policies for our officers. It is on that basis that I implore this body to promote legislation that, 1, helps to enhance accountability and address misconduct, 2, further promotes transparency, 3, addresses racial disparities in policing and protects human life, 4, enhances prosecutorial practices, and 5, supports funding opportunities for law enforcement agencies promoting progressive, culturally relevant, community-oriented policing programming that's specifically designed to address racial profiling, mental health, and community advisory platforms. On May 25, 2020, the world looked on America in horror as we collectively watched in real time the public lynching of George Floyd at the hands of men sworn to protect him. Though the 9 minutes and 30 seconds of gut-wrenching footage will forever be seared as a mark of embarrassment against us and a moment of pain for his family, we here in Virginia share our own shames and pains, such as the life of Marcus Peters that was taken at the hands of Richmond Police Department. Until we, as a Commonwealth, not only fully address the issues at hand, but ensure that there is access in communities that have often been systematically oppressed by bad racially embedded policies that this oldest continuous legislative body in the New World has introduced, passed, and successfully implemented, then we, the citizens of the Commonwealth, will continue to adhere to the charge left to us by the late Congressman John Lewis, which is by getting in good trouble, necessary trouble. And for those who haven't heard it in a while, Black lives still matter. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hunt. Are there any questions for Mr. Hunt? All right, well, thank you for your testimony today, John. I really appreciate you being here. Our next speaker is Sheriff Gabriel Morgan from Newport News. Sheriff Morgan, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Welcome, Sheriff Morgan. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Chairman Hope, Majority Leader Herron, thank you for allowing me a few minutes to express some comments and concerns to this body.
Hold on. You can't hold on until
Hello?
says something, and then you can say
hello.
Can we you mute your phones, please?
Right, but then what happens when the person who's speaking?
Suzette, we can hear you.
Thank you. Please continue, Sheriff Morgan.
I do not have a PowerPoint, and as much as I was told I would only have 3 minutes. So I will go through some topics rather quickly and then hopefully leave time for some question and answers. I won't go in too much into my background other than to say that I've been in law enforcement now 44 years, and I have served every governor since Gilmore on issues of law reform in the Commonwealth. I just concluded my chairmanship as the chair of the Virginia Law Enforcement Professional Commission. So the first thing that I would like to say to this commission is we are looking at trying to, as the Commonwealth, we're talking about trying to fix something versus trying to rebuild something or to build something. And I will tell you that in the short term, yes, we need some immediate change, but we need to begin to think and reimagine law enforcement. What I have seen over the years from opioid, from mental health, overall, every failure in our society has fallen in the laps of law enforcement. We have to do better as a society, and we cannot allow the police agencies to be the de facto for everything that fails. So the first thing is, here in America and in the Commonwealth, we have some of the shortest amount of training hours allocated to training law enforcement, but we give them some of the biggest responsibilities. Not even a judge can take you off the street without paperwork, but a police officer can. DCJS only requires 400 hours of training, and here in our local academy, we're doing somewhere around 760 hours, almost double what DCJS mandates. But I'm here to tell you it's not enough. If we look at Germany and some of the other countries, their training goes 2 to 4 years sometimes. And the reason for that is it takes a while to get folks where they need to be. So the first thing is, again, we need to reimagine what is it that we want police agencies to do and what that should look like, and then formulate the training around that. Right now, we're doing a hodgepodge. You know, we have problems with mental health. Then we do CIT, 40 hours of training for CIT just to try to deal with that. Well, at the end of the day, we need to look at it holistically. The next thing I want to talk about is decertification. You've heard a lot about decertification. Let me just give you one example. I won't call the agency's name. We had an agency where an individual working drugs lied about the testimony received by an informant. That person was already under investigation. They were wearing a wire. Everything that was said was recorded. That person perjured themselves on affidavit for a search warrant. We knew it. We had the evidence. It went to trial. Because of jury nullification, the jury said, I'm not going to convict a police officer for overstepping to get the bad guy. This individual was found not guilty for perjury. This individual went to arbitration, got their job back, and we were not allowed to decertify that individual. That is just an egregious account for how difficult it is for us to decertify and get rid of bad cops. You've heard enough about that. I just want to highlight that. One other thing that came up recently, no knock, and we go back and forth, and there's a lot of arguments that we need no knock. I will tell you that over 44 years, I can tell you that we can execute, and no knock should be taken off the table. Accreditation. I talked to you briefly the fact that I chaired this. I've been doing accreditation in Virginia since 2009. Currently, we only have 25% of the agencies throughout Virginia that are either CALEA certified or LESI certified. And the reason I bring this up is that LESI and CALEA's accreditation are really almost a carbon copy. Chief Boone talked to you about CALEA being certified and the cost. Well, the reason we developed LESI in the state was because we knew not every agency can afford CALEA, but every agency can afford LESI, and we should be working towards ensuring that every agency in Virginia follows a uniform standard. So I would be willing to sit down with anyone to talk more about accreditation.
Sheriff Morgan, can I get you to wrap up, please?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
In the wrap up, House Bill 1250 just would like to add that we need to look at having DMV to add race to their database. And the reason I'm saying that is we need to strengthen that 1250. Right now, we're expecting law enforcement agents to say what they see, and what they see may not be accurate. If we want the best data, if DMV had race added to our driving record, then they can take it off of there. And then the last component on House Bill 1250 to strengthen that would be to use some sort of university to do the data analytic, and then also to make some recommendations overall.
Thank you, Sheriff Morgan. Thank you so much for your testimony. Delegate Sullivan, you're recognized for the question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just briefly, Sheriff Morgan, thanks very much. There was a brief moment in your testimony that I just lost the thread. I wasn't sure what you meant. You were talking about no knocks, and you said we can execute, and then you said no knock should be taken off the table. Did you mean you could do without no knocks, or do you mean we should not be considering doing away with no knocks and take it off the table that way?
I'm saying law enforcement can do without no knock.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Delegate Sullivan, are there other questions from members? Delegate Morgan, thank you so much for your time and your testimony. We really value your opinion, and I appreciate you being here today. Next speaker, thank you. Next speaker is Sean McGowan. Sean is from the Virginia Police Benevolent Association. Mr. McGowan, thank you so much for being here. We look forward to your testimony.
Mr. Chair, Sean McGowan is in the room. Sean McGowan, if you can unmute your microphone.
Okay, are we on now?
I can hear you just fine. Thank you, Mr. McGowan. Thank you for being here. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Committee Chair, Delegate Hope, Delegate Herring, committee members, and Madam Speaker, if you're still on. I am Sean McGowan, Virginia Police Benevolent Association Executive Director. Our organization represents over 6,000 law enforcement professionals in Virginia and over 60,000 law enforcement professionals in the Southeast United States. We are grateful to receive the invitation to address you today. It's important that you all understand the primary goals of the Virginia PBA and our unique philosophy regarding representation of our members as a labor organization. Our Constitution and bylaws prohibit our members from condoning or participating in any job action or strike. We feel that public safety should never be jeopardized by job actions. Our legal department also reserves the right to refuse representation to any member who knowingly violates department policy or law. Simply put, if a member does not act in good faith and intentionally breaks the law or department policy, we will not represent them. The founding guidelines have remained unchanged for us for 50 years. The PBA regards both of these policies as essential to increase professionalism in law enforcement, which is one of our primary goals. Many of you already know these facts about the PBA policy and procedure. I repeat them now to emphasize that we share this common goal of law enforcement professionalism with each of you. Our members regard changes to constitutional protected government official qualified immunity and the reduction of crime status of assault on officer as extreme and an unnecessary reaction that negatively impacts public safety and reduces the candidate pool for qualified new law enforcement officers. Neither of these issues contributes to our common goal of improving law enforcement as a profession. The PBA is eager to enter into the discussion about policies, procedures, and police response to offer the perspective of the line officers answering the calls for service and being the first to respond when a citizen calls for help. Our members are the officers who are making the daily split-second decisions and who will be the first to apply the knowledge from increases in training and education. Information from our members will be invaluable in the discussion regarding scene response and call situations that may require resources other than police. Our members support department accreditation, which improves operations by implementing department policies and procedures which act as guidelines for both the department and the officers. A sound department policy protects our citizens, the officers, and the administration. Officer decertification is certainly one way to prevent problems from continuing from one agency to another. As an organization, we have no objection to the decertification process that affords the officer with due process. Our ultimate goal is to have Brady and Giglio law can be incorporated into the decertification process, which hopefully would give a level of due process to Brady and Giglio issues. That due process is glaringly absent in current law. Protecting bad officers is not and never will be an acceptable goal of the PBA. Our organizational policies and practices display to all that a disregard for law will never be tolerated. As I said before, we share many common goals, and we look forward to working with you to achieve them. Our members hope that during this special session, you will take the time to consider that improvements we all agree on need to be subjected to the full legislative process during the 2021 session to avoid the possibility of unintended consequences that could result from legislation hastily pushed through a special session. Thank you for the opportunity to be involved in this important discussion, and I'm happy to take any questions or any of you to contact me at any time.
Thank you, Mr. McGowan. And I understand congratulations are in order because you had a new grandchild. So congratulations to you.
Thank you.
Delegate Price, you're recognized.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. McGowan. I understand wanting to slow walk some of the new ideas that may have come out, but are there any other policy proposals that have been perhaps presented consistently over the last 5 to 10 years that you would be open to discussing with us for systemic changes for policing?
Oh, absolutely. We would love to give our perspective at any of those discussions. I am always available Delegate Herring has my personal cell, as do many delegates, and I would absolutely make the time anytime you would like to enter into those discussions with me. But we give a unique perspective. We are the voice for the line officers, the ones that are out there, again, making these split-second decisions, and I think it's critical to have their voices heard.
Thank you, Delegate Price. Are there other questions from members for Mr. McGowan? Okay, well, hearing none, I appreciate it very much. Thank you, Mr. McGowan, for your testimony. We really value your opinion. Why don't we go ahead and then move over to the public comment portion. This portion is we're pulling in the public to speak, 3 minutes per speaker. And I will be somewhat lenient, but also I want to be respectful. So everyone try to keep your comments within 3 minutes. Our first speaker is Bonnie Burkhart. Bonnie, we're going to ask you to come in to offer testimony.
Mr. Chair, Bonnie Burkhart is in the room. Bonnie, if you could please unmute your microphone.
Okay. Am I unmuted?
Bonnie, we can hear you. Thank you, Ms. Burkhart.
My name is Bonnie Burkhart. I have a top secret security clearance and over 35 years experience intercepting and analyzing signals for the Department of Defense. I'm well trained to obey interception and privacy laws for my job. The police organization ICAC, Internet Crimes Against Children, use tactics which directly violate these laws. I wrote 2 amicus briefs with appendices that discuss these illegal tactics, and they are filed with the Appellate Court of Virginia. Officers illegally impersonate children to intercept communications exchanged. Number 2, officers use special tools over the internet to secretly break into private computers and search them without a warrant. Number 3, officers unmask the identity of users and geolocate them without a warrant. Police and prosecutors should be held to the same standard of law as me. These illegal tactics manufacture criminals to get grant money and account for about 20% of Virginia inmates. Officers conduct sting operations by creating an online profile of an imaginary child who does not exist. They post a picture of someone else, then impersonate them when sending text messages to random men. Sometimes they impersonate real children. But no crime has yet occurred. Officers use entrapment to create a crime, then rack up as many as 20 felonies for 350 years in prison to force a plea deal, which is extortion. The interception law clearly states such person must be part of the conversation, not an impersonator, not an imaginary person. The law provides no exceptions for police. I met with Stafford Sheriff's Department to discuss my complaint. I said, you can't intercept or invent a person to intercept communications for you. Major Lenhart replied, I bet you can. Not that that doesn't mean it's right. This has been going on for years. If it was illegal in the state, somebody would have stopped it by now. When I worked up in Fairfax, there was a whole unit that did nothing but troll on the internet. There are thousands and thousands getting arrested for this. The law only applies to wiretapping a telephone, right? I read the law to him, 19.2-62. Any person who intercepts or procures another person to intercept any wire, electronic or oral communication shall be guilty of a Class 6 felony. Their reply was typical, nothing will be done. To identify which computers to remotely search, detectives have a database which inventories the content of people's private computers, data obtained without a warrant. It contains IP addresses, file names, subscriber info, and hash codes, which they use to fingerprint the exact content on computers. Breaking into files and taking transactional records violates 18 U.S. Code 2701, the Stored Communication Law. We need to respect the cops on the street, but ICAC is manufacturing criminals for money. We need to defund ICAC's illegal operations, overturn their convictions, and hold officers and prosecutors accountable. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Burkhart. Our next speaker, and just a reminder to all the speakers, we encourage you to please turn on your camera, if you don't mind. Next speaker is Dhruv Rungta, and I apologize if I butchered your name. Dhruv Rungta.
Yes, hello. Good afternoon, Chairman Hope and members of the committee. My name is Dhruv Rungta. I'm speaking on behalf of a student advocacy group from the University of Virginia. I'm here today to urge this body to solidify its efforts in its endeavor to create and subsequently pass legislature focused on the banning of kinetic impact projectiles, including rubber bullets, in their use against civilians by our militarized police force. Over the past few months, Americans have protested nationwide due to the senseless killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and many more by law enforcement. During these protests, police have utilized rubber bullets as a tactic to disperse crowds. However, according to the nonprofit Physicians for Human Rights and the ACLU, both studies have been linked in my written testimony, rubber bullets are not an appropriate weapon to use in crowd control settings. The non-lethal status of these weapons has been called into question, given that they can cause blindness, bone fractures, severe organ damage, and death. A meta-analysis in the British Medical Journal, again linked in my written testimony, found that 15% of patients treated for kinetic impact projectile injuries were permanently disabled, and 3% of patients died from their wounds. Death and injuries are often the result of incorrect use of these weapons that require additional instruction and training, something which many police officers, both in Virginia and around the country, have not received. Let us establish that these devices are called non-lethal weapons that have been documented to be used by our law enforcement agencies against peaceful men, women, as well as children, resulting in hundreds injured and dozens dead, fostering resentment and a sense of despair in what we describe to be the land of the free. How can we argue to be a beacon of hope for the world when we are not a beacon of hope for our own people? Again, I urge this committee to consider the ramifications of the continued use of these devices and the immediate benefits of banning their use. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your testimony, Mr. Runka. Our next speaker is Elizabeth Carr.
Hello, can you hear me?
Can hear you just fine. Thank you, Ms. Carr.
Perfect.
Thank you for being
Yes, excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having us. Mr. Chairman, I ask that all written questions and answers you encouraged throughout the meeting be made available to the public. Is this possible?
Yeah, we will get responses available. That's right.
Wonderful. And similarly, Delegate Watts, can you share the psychological screening link you were given with the public as well? If somebody could pass that on to Delegate Watts, that would be great. Moving on.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Why would a cop turn off his body cam? Why would a cop pop the hood of his cruiser? Why would a cop cover his badge number? The answer to all these questions is the same. He is premeditating his own crimes. If a cop turns off his body cam, he is a bad cop. This is non-negotiable. How do we know this? Because good cops have nothing to hide. We taxpayers paid for the cameras. We demand they be turned on, kept on, data downloaded properly. It is for our safety, for everyone's safety. All cops statewide must have body cameras on for the entirety of their shift. Please pass legislation that requires body cams statewide. Pass legislation that makes tampering with, turning off, obscuring cameras, microphones, and identifying information illegal and punishable. Cops should have consequences for turning off or obstructing cameras. Cops who do this have repeatedly proven they cannot be trusted to do their job safely and fairly. First and foremost, they should be decertified, as Ms. Khanna mentioned. No recertification allowed, effectively permanently fired, which means they cannot rejoin the police force anywhere in the state of Virginia. Secondly, in the absence of their own body cam footage, Leo verbal testimony should be inadmissible. Third, the infraction be made public information. By allowing any police violence through omission, you encourage all future police violence through omission. All future blood is on your hands if you do not pass legislation now. I yield the rest of my time.
Thank you so much, Ms. Carr. Our next speaker is Breanne Armbrust. Breanne Armbrust.
Mr. Chair, Breanne Armbrust is in the meeting. Breanne, if you can just unmute your microphone.
Okay, my apologies. Are you all able to hear me?
Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you. I will keep my comments very brief because you all have sat through some very long presentations, and I'd like to give time to the other public speakers. I have witnessed since May 29th extreme levels of police violence in the city of Richmond and throughout the state that really trouble me for a number of reasons. I am very hopeful that we can take action and that you all will take action as state legislators to limit the ability of local and state police to use chemical weapons such as tear gas and rubber bullets against protesters or anyone in our cities throughout the state. I've witnessed that from Virginia State Police in addition to local police, and the bulk purchase of munitions that were made throughout the month of June by Virginia State Police is very troubling. I've heard in the presentations this morning about justifications for the militarization of police by police, and I think that that's completely unacceptable to be used against residents in our state. We are not terrorists. We have the right to free speech, and I hope that as legislators, you all will support that in the General Assembly. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Ms. Ambrose. Thank you so much for your testimony. Our next public speaker is Kofi Annan. Mr. Annan, thank you for being here. We appreciate your testimony.
Mr. Chair, Kofi Annan is in the meeting. Mr. Annan, if you can unmute your microphone, please.
Yes, hi, good morning.
Good morning. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Watts, Chair Herring, Hope, and Chair Bourne for this opportunity. My name is Kofi Annan. I'm the president of the Activated People and chair of the Nova Equity Agenda Coalition, steering committee member of the Virginia Coalition for the Transforming Police, and immediate past president of the Fairfax NAACP and former Virginia State Conference NAACP Criminal Justice Committee chair. Our country remains in the midst of the largest and the longest running mass protests ever witnessed. Why? Why is that? Even though these protests were triggered by George Floyd's brutal murder, the outrage stems from a deeper frustration that has hundreds of years in the making. More importantly, these protests stem from the desire to see real change. In June, the Activated People-led Virginia Coalition for the Transforming Police formed with the mission of addressing these harmful policing practices. The coalition convened a series of listening sessions with over 500 citizens across the Commonwealth, and what we heard was that people wanted police involved in fewer issues, and they overwhelmingly said that they didn't trust the police to change their own culture or to hold themselves accountable. The result of these listening sessions is the Reimagined Police Package, which I shared with in the chat, and hopefully it gets to you with the full list. The comprehensive list of legislative priorities, which has garnered support from dozens of advocacy groups such as Justice Forward and other nonprofit organizations and religious institutions across the Commonwealth, aims to reduce police responsibilities and budgets and transfer non-criminal offenses to organizations that are better equipped to handle people experiencing mental health crisis or emotional trauma, while also preserving the sanctity of life. The Reimagined Police Package also aims to improve the quality of the men and women who are allowed to wear the badge and bolster transparency and accountability mechanisms by placing more control into the hands of the communities they serve. We demand that our police, we demand that you defund our police and put that money into the programs that uplift underserved Black and Brown communities, such as affordable housing, education, teachers, counselors, drug and alcohol treatment, mental health programs, and homelessness prevention programs. We demand greater transparency and civilian oversight at all levels, stronger use of force standards, and greater accountability, such as ending qualified immunity and stronger decertification standards. And finally, we demand that the police be taken out of our schools because Black and Brown babies' lives matter too. We all want safe and orderly classrooms, but no one should want or expect our law enforcement to become entangled in disciplinary issues that should otherwise be handled administratively. School resource officer programs nationwide have rocketed the school-to-prison pipeline into hyperdrive, and Black and Latinx children are paying dearly. Changing the standards of conduct will not produce the results that we seek. For example, in Fairfax County, the Memorandum of Understanding was changed in 2018, yet 2 years later, the recent data show that these regulations were not being followed, and hundreds of Black and Brown kids were still being charged with crimes such as disorderly conduct, trespassing, larceny, and assaults. We're
Mr.
not
Anand,
just
can I-
marching for justice for George Floyd, but we're looking forward to a better future. Thank you for the time.
Thank you so much, Mr. Anand. We appreciate your advocacy and being here today. Our next speaker is Michael Harvey.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me?
Can hear you great. Thank you, Mr. Harvey.
Excellent. Thank you, Chairman Hope, and thank you, Leader Herring. This has been a very good and enlightening meeting so far today, and I really appreciate the time that everyone is taking to listen to the demands of our citizens as they are demanding a culture shift within policing. For those of you who don't know, I am the Executive Director of the Rappahannock Regional Criminal Justice Academy in Fredericksburg, Virginia. And I am the past president for the Virginia Criminal Justice Directors Association. So I'm honored to be able to be with you today. Certainly there's many things that you all can do from the legislative and the administrative side that we've heard from our chiefs and our sheriffs this morning to ensure that our agencies and our officers are held accountable and are transparent to the public for which we serve. And undoubtedly, over the next few months, you all will be engaged in very purposeful and meaningful debate on what this will look like and whether it will be best served as new legislation or handled by the regulatory bodies such as Department of Criminal Justice Services. I ask that you, as you enter these debates, we put our partisanship aside, because today is not the time to call ourselves Democrats or Republicans, but time to call ourselves Virginians and move forward as such. As we do engage in these discussions over administrative, operational, and training issues, I ask that you don't forget about the dollars that it's going to take to implement these things. As a regional academy director, my budget is very, very, very thin. I walk a very tight line to make sure that we can stay operational. And any unfunded mandates that would come our way would put a undue burden on my training academy. And while I can't speak for the other regional academies, I'm almost certain it would put a very hard strain on them as well. As we focus on how to best change the culture of policing, I also ask that not only do you take a look at changes for policing, but look at the moral and the social issues that have been delegated to the police, much as like what we've heard today. As a society, we've grappled with issues such as mental illness and addiction, and as we grapple with those, we have increasingly asked our police to step in. I ask that you find solutions to remove police from the front lines of mental health disease and work to repeal laws that have been shown to have a disparate impact on our communities of color and our most economically vulnerable populations. I worry that if we only look to change the culture of policing without also addressing these moral and societal issues directly affecting our communities, we will do little to change the distrust of our police by the communities that they serve. Chairman, thank you for allowing me the time to speak today. I really appreciate it. And I am always available if anybody has any more questions or concerns that I can answer.
Thank you, Mr. Harvey. Thank you so much for being here in your testimony. Next speaker is Dave Rogers.
Hi, yes.
Hi, Dave. Mr. Rogers,
Hi.
thank you for.
Certainly, thank you for having me. I'm Dave Rogers. I'm a long-term resident of Hampton and a retired police officer from the Hampton Police Division. I served from 1977 to 2005, retiring with the rank of lieutenant. Most of my career was spent in operational assignments such as patrol and investigations, so I'm quite familiar with the responsibilities of being a first responder. My goal today is to give a voice and support to those who are now serving and provide information to those seeking changes in policing policies. It is my perception that policing and law enforcement officers in general are under attack and being blamed for unresolved social problems. There are demands that the police should be removed from a number of social issues, defunding is the popular term, and there are calls for police reform. Mental health and associated homelessness, domestic violence, and police in schools seem to be the issues most often mentioned. Current police responses to these issues were created by previous reform movements, and now that they are under attack, those that were promoting it don't stand up for them, and that is left to the police to defend policies that others wanted in place. I contend that it's perhaps society that needs reform, reevaluating what it really wants from its police officers. Having a social services component handling these matters would be a full-time operation, around the clock, nights, weekends, holidays, working outside the normal work week. Responders would have to learn to work under all types of conditions, including violence, poor environmental and sanitary conditions, and extreme weather, just like the policemen are doing now. Domestic violence has an even more urgent need for immediate response. Current state law was promoted by domestic violence advocates in the mid-1990s, and maybe some of you delegates were voted for it back in the day. We need to note, though, that assaults and homicides against domestic partners have dropped dramatically since they initiated the current policy, and despite occasional problems, police involvement in arresting the primary aggressor and obtaining protective orders seem to be working. The removal of police officers from schools is another demand of protesters, and this is supported by some teacher groups. Law enforcement agencies did not unilaterally decide to place officers in schools, but did so in response to citizen requests that it be done. If you want to have police officers in the schools, say so publicly, as those pushing for removal are controlling the narrative. By far, the majority of police officers and law enforcement officers conduct themselves in a professional manner, frequently working in adverse conditions. This needs to be recognized and supported, as day-to-day policing has not stopped during the current social unrest nor the ongoing pandemic. The public still requests police services around the clock and during emergency circumstances expects a prompt response. Thank you and have a good day.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers. Next speaker is Jason Fritz.
Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me?
We can hear you. Thank you, Mr. Fritz.
Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me now?
I can hear you, Mr. Fritz. Thank you. Are you there, Mr. Fritz?
Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me?
I can hear you. I don't think you can hear us.
I just see. Yeah.
Mr. Fritz, can you hear us?
Hello?
Mr. Chair, would you like us to queue up another person?
Why don't we go to the next speaker while you work that out with Mr. Fritz, Michael Payne.
Again, I can't hear you. If you can hear me, I'm sorry.
Michael Payne, is that you?
Yes,
Thank
hello.
You for welcome.
Hi, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm here today to speak on the topic of crowd control weapons on behalf of Physicians for Human Rights, a global organization that brings the expertise of science and medicine to the protection and promotion of human rights. For more than 3 decades, PHR has investigated and documented the health effects and harms caused by so-called non-lethal crowd control weapons. PHR has conducted investigations of injuries and deaths caused by these crowd control weapons around the world. We have reviewed cases upon cases of serious injuries, disabilities, and death attributed to CCWs. Our work that I highlight here today provides an overview of some health consequences of CCWs and examines their use in a variety of contexts. Kinetic impact projectiles, or KIPs, such as rubber bullets, can cause blunt or penetrative trauma, Penetrative injuries are those that pierce the skin or soft tissue. Blunt injuries are those that cause internal damage without breaking the skin barrier. Direct trauma to the eye from KIPs nearly always causes total blindness in that eye. KIPs can also penetrate through the eye socket and enter the brain, causing brain injury. KIPs can cause bruising of the lungs or heart, and penetration into the heart, into the chest may cause serious, possibly fatal injuries. Blunt trauma to the brain can cause concussions and contusions, as well as different types of intracranial hemorrhaging and skull fractures. KIPs have also been known to penetrate the skull or enter the brain tissue, causing severe brain injury. When KIPs are fired at close range, the risk for more serious injury is increased. When launched from afar, these weapons are inaccurate and can strike vulnerable body parts, as well as cause unintended injuries to bystanders. Therefore, there are significant doubts that these weapons can be used in a manner that is simultaneously safe and effective. Chemical irritants such as tear gas and pepper spray, meanwhile, are inherently indiscriminate. Accordingly, the risk of exposing bystanders and individuals other than the intended targets, including vulnerable people, is high. Moreover, while the public perception may be that chemical irritants cause minimal transient harm, PHR research has identified troubling levels of morbidity and even instances of death caused by these weapons. Such injuries include damage to the eyes, including possible corneal burns, lacerations, or blindness, oral and gastrointestinal mucosa, which may result in excessive vomiting or blood vessel ruptures, including hypoxia, blood vessel ruptures, respiratory damage, which may precipitate respiratory distress, including resulting in hypoxia, respiratory arrest, and death, or cardiovascular stress, particularly for those with pre-existing heart conditions, which combined with respiratory distress also increases the danger of heart attack and death. In light of the dangers identified by PHR, we urge the Virginia legislature to restrict the use of chemical irritants and kinetic impact projectiles to only the most extreme instances that meet the tests of minimized, targeted, proportional force, and only as a last resort. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And then we just have
Thank you very much, Mr. Payne. I appreciate it very much. The next speaker is Richard Walker. Richard Walker is our next speaker.
Hello?
Hi, Mr. Walker.
Good afternoon. Richard Walker here. I appreciate the time. To the respective chairs, thank you for the opportunity. I'm the founder and CEO of a grassroots nonprofit organization, Bridging the Gap in Virginia. As a direct result of my incarceration and release from prison and an inability to get gainfully hired based on my skills, knowledge, and abilities, I was being judged by my criminal background. I've since started that organization as a direct result that there are numerous individuals coming out of incarceration that will face this same dilemma. However, my main purpose of wanting to speak is dealing with expungements. Okay, I can quote Carter Glass back in 1902 that stated in the Constitution Convention for the Commonwealth of Virginia that if we continue to disenfranchise individuals that have committed a crime, that will stop the darkies from being a part of our government. That is still taking place now. It's time to change the narrative in the Commonwealth of Virginia. It's time to allow for individuals to have a piece of America, by expunging or sealing their records for 8 years or beyond would help individuals to be able to take care of their families more efficiently, to be able to become more self-sufficient, will be able to move forward in life and reduce the crime, reduce the welfare rolls, and will make more persons eligible to move forward in life. This has been a pet peeve of mine since I came home from prison, back in 2005. Also, in this past General Assembly, I was so disheartened because the bill was presented in 8 different persons, 8 different patronages. And I was heard to be told that it has to be killed. You know, that went directly to Delegate Scott, who was the only one that was able to present his bill. You know, I since wrote the bill myself in 2019 and gave it to Delegate Dolores McQuinn, which Delegate Lindsay took it up in 2020. You know, at some point, we need to disclaim what Senator Glass said in 1902. As far as I'm concerned, I still believe that this is a way of keeping the darkies out of the government by keeping them disenfranchised from participating in the government and the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Virginia. At what point do we stop this? At what point do we have the individuals in the Commonwealth of Virginia move forward? You know, I've been pioneered in ban the box issue that got the ordinance passed in Richmond, supported it in other municipalities to help individuals get gainfully employed. But expungement is ideal. I have individuals that committed crimes 20 and 30 years ago, you know, that cannot get their records sealed. You know, and I'm not talking about mainly violent individuals. I'm talking about nonviolent individuals. You have close to 350,000 individuals in Commonwealth of Virginia that are convicted felons that should be eligible to get their.
Mr. Walker, can you please wrap up, please?
Right. So I implore you, you know, please let this come up in legislation to be changed. You know, and also the other thing that needs to be changed, automatic restoration of rights. No one's rights should have been taken from the beginning. You know, that this was something that was constitutional to the United States Constitution, that Virginia should not have the right to remove individuals from having the ability to vote for their voice in the government. You know, it's just
thank you, Mr. Walker.
The DC went through. No,
thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your time. Our next speaker is Juliet Hisney. Ms. Hisney, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Mr. Chair, Juliet Hisney is in the room. Ms. Juliet, if you could unmute your microphone. Thank you.
Ms. Hisney, are you there? Can you hear us?
I am here. Can you hear me?
Welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon. Thank you for holding this hearing. Thank you to the chairs and the members. My name is Juliet Hisney. I'm a special education attorney and civil rights attorney. My background is in litigation, including criminal, and I am a co-founder of the Coalition for Trauma-Informed Schools. I'm speaking on my own behalf here. Unfortunately, I've become something of an expert in the area of restraint through my work in public schools with special education students. So although I'm interested in broader concerns, I wanted to share some information about that with you today. As you know, George Floyd was subjected to a prone physical restraint that's on the ground face down. He was also mechanically restrained with handcuffs, and the body weight of 3 grown men physically compressed several body parts, including his neck. Prone restraint is one of the most dangerous restraints and highly associated with death. Virginia is in the process of issuing regulations prohibiting prone restraint in public schools. What I want to convey is that whatever legislation you pass should be informed by the medical literature, which is extensive. Regulation of restraints was first addressed in the hospital setting where very significant restrictions are in place. Restraint is known to result in death, but the cause of death can include not only asphyxia, but also cardiac arrest and thrombosis. In addition to crush injuries, emotional and physical stress of restraint results in a catecholamine rush, a massive release of chemicals by the adrenal glands. Catecholamine rush can lead to multi-system crisis, including organ failure. Once an individual is taken to the ground, it can be difficult to avoid a level of force that becomes a risk to both the police officer and to the detained person. Such techniques need to be strictly restricted. It is essential to make sure that the restrictions on the use of restraint by law enforcement address not only the prohibition of a particular hold, but also prevention. Deaths will continue to occur in Virginia if current use of force protocols are not changed. The use of electroshock weapons, such as tasers, also creates a high risk of injury or death. Those with mental health conditions, including trauma history and disability, are at particular risk. In 2017, 15-year-old Jeremiah Fleming died at the North Springs Therapeutic Residential Program during a physical restraint. Although the staff member was charged with homicide, the staff member was found not guilty because the defense presented evidence that a heart problem contributed to the death. It can be nearly impossible to obtain a criminal conviction for this type of death, even when the evidence is clear that the restraint was never justified and the person was alive before the restraint and died during the restraint. For this reason, I strongly encourage you to consider eliminating qualified immunity under state law so that victims of excessive force and their families can pursue private tort claims when civil rights are violated. I hope you will take this information into consideration during the special session in August and, as necessary, the upcoming 2021 session. And as a final note, I need to convey to you the seriousness of what is happening in our public schools. Qualified immunity also needs to be addressed in the educational setting. We are experiencing thousands of restraint and seclusion episodes across the Commonwealth, and it is a violation of the civil rights of children. Children should not be ignored as we consider our reform efforts in the Commonwealth. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Hisney, for your time. We appreciate your testimony. Our next speaker is going to be Jason Fritz. We're going to try him again. I have all hope, no pun intended, that he will be able to get in. Jason Fritz.
Good afternoon. I think that we may have solved our technological issues, and I apologize for what happened earlier. Good afternoon. My many thanks to the chairs, the opportunity to address this joint committee. My name is Dr. Jason Fritz. I'm a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University's Center for Advanced Governmental Studies, but today I'm only representing myself. My research includes the study of police militarization, both at home and abroad, and I will focus my comments on police militarization here in the U.S., specifically Virginia, of course. Militarized policing has come to the fore of public discourse since the aggressive law enforcement response to protests in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014. And of course, recent police responses to protests across the country this summer have shown this is still a problem, and it is a nationwide problem. It's not a local problem just in Missouri. And it is a problem based in equipment and mindset interactions between the police and the public. There has been ample research, including my own, that shows that police militarization is not correlated with violent crimes across the country, and this is specifically true also in Virginia. While I agree with Chief DeBoer's comments earlier that equipment does not inherently mean militarization, there is research out there that suggests a connection between equipment and mindset, in that agencies that militarize tend to use deadly force more often than less militarized agencies. Beyond the data, we as citizens should be asking why almost every county, municipality, and specialty law enforcement agency requires military capabilities. What is the law enforcement requirement for the widespread distribution of armored vehicles or military-grade assault rifles? Enforcement events that actually require the deployment of these tools are few and far between, and inappropriate use of these tools is much more likely. I would suggest that Virginia, and all states for that matter, should significantly reform its policies on police militarizations. I have a few specific recommendations to demilitarize police in Virginia and based on my many years of research on this topic. First, I suggest the Commonwealth of Virginia shut down or at least limit its pipelines between local police agencies and federal programs that distribute or facilitate the acquisition of military equipment. This includes the Virginia State Police Office to manage the Commonwealth's 1033 office and the Department of Criminal Justice Services management of Federal Department of Homeland Security grants. Short of closing these offices, I would suggest limiting their authority to support requests for specific classes of military equipment and providing guidelines for localities to make requests as exceptions to standard policy. Second, I do recognize that there is a law enforcement requirement for high-end policing capabilities throughout the Commonwealth, but I believe these capabilities should be centralized within the state police. I would suggest that the state police be asked to create a plan that includes a needs assessment for the regional distribution of high-end capabilities based on a realistic threat assessment. This would be the start of a conversation between the state police and the legislature to derive a distribution of these capabilities that meets a law enforcement need while protecting the interests of citizens. Finally, militarization is not just equipment, as my friend Dr. Lindsay Cohn addressed this morning. It is also a mindset held by members of law enforcement agencies. One way to erode this militarized mindset, most cruelly described as one that sees the police as an enemy to be controlled instead of fellow citizens to be protected, and that is to outlaw warrior-style training throughout the Commonwealth. These training programs promote an overly aggressive approach to policing, And some include training a mindset to make use of lethal force more psychologically acceptable. There's no place for this mindset in the law enforcement agencies of a democratic republic. Virginia should outlaw this training outright. I'll end my comments there, and I thank the chairs and the committees again for this opportunity and apologize again for my technical issues earlier. I would be happy to provide additional written comments about any aspects of my testimony today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fritz, and thank you for staying with it. We really appreciate your testimony. Final speaker of this afternoon is Garnett Robbins Bowman. Garnett, are you?
Mr. Chair, Garnett Robbins Bowman is in the meeting.
Garnett, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Ms. Robbins Bowman, we cannot hear you.
Well, that is our last speaker. Do you think you might be able to get Ms. Robbins Bowman? Okay, it doesn't appear to be an active mic. So let's go ahead and that's the last meeting. So that does conclude the hearing. Before we adjourn, though, I do want to turn it over to Leader Herring to talk about the next hearing, the next steps for us. Leader Herring.
Thank you, Chairman Hope. Our next hearing is July 29th at 10 a.m. The topic areas will be training of law enforcement officers, which will include topics of community engaged policing, bias, and hate crimes. Then we will be talking about Commonwealth attorney bias, as well as judicial bias and mandatory minimums. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here, and I thank our guests so much and our public who have taken the time to share their thoughts.
Thank you, Leader Herring. I'll turn it over to the clerk to see if she has any final announcements.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is Cheryl Wilson. Just a few announcements. The presentations from today's meeting have been posted on the meeting webpage and are available to the public. Written comments submitted, we will be checking those daily. We will continue to send those to members and post them online as they are received until there are no new comments. And Mr. Chair, if I may, I believe I saw the members who didn't answer the roll call earlier come into the meeting, but just for the record, if I could call these names, and if you hear your name, please unmute your microphone and indicate your presence. Delegate Corey. Delegate Corey. Delegate Lopez.
Hello.
Kay, you want to speak?
Sorry, I couldn't unmute. Yes, I've been here throughout the hearing. I'm going to mute again. Thanks.
Delegate Lopez, I was here 15 minutes earlier than my system died, but I got back on as fast as I could, and I've been here the whole time.
Thank you, sir. I thought I'd seen you. Delegate Lindsay.
I'm here.
Thank you, sir. Delegate Sullivan.
I'm here. Sorry to have been a little late.
That's all right. And Delegate Price, I've got you, ma'am. Delegate Heretic.
Yes, I'm here.
All right, great. Mr. Chair, thank you. That completes our announcements.
Thank you, Cheryl. I know it's been a long day for everyone. They were able to get Ms. Robbins Bowman into the queue. I know it's been a long meeting. She's been waiting too. I'd like to hear her testimony, so if we can indulge the committee will indulge me. I'd like to recognize Ms. Robbins Bowman. You have 3 minutes, Ms. Bowman. Welcome. All right, it doesn't appear like we fixed the problem. Well, it was worth a try anyway. Well, that concludes the meeting. I do want to thank a lot of people that made today possible and future hearings. First, Cheryl Wilson and her staff and committee staff for putting all this together. Our IT department entirely, Sharon Crouch-Steidel as well, and of course our clerk, Suzette Dinslow, for making all this work. This is pretty historic what we've done, not just to hear from our expert testimony, but also to hear from the public in such a respectful way. And so I appreciate doing that. So with that, the committee will rise.